the results were extraordinary. About a third, and this has been replicated in multiple studies, but about a third will say it was the most meaningful and spiritually significant experience of their life. This is not like laying on a couch in a hospital in Baltimore. I mean, like, have people seen The Wire? I mean, that really says something.
Matthew Johnson, Ph.D., is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins University. And if you know anything about Johns Hopkins, they do a lot of research on psychedelic medicine, and Matthew Johnson is right in the center of so much of that research. But not only psychedelic medicine, research on the effects of all types of drugs, hard drugs, soft drugs, medium drugs, all the different types of drugs, and we get into everything on this podcast. It was one of my favorite conversations of the year, and I can't wait to present to you Matthew Johnson. The truth is that we're all the master, we're all the healer, we're all the mystic.
Give it up one time for Aubrey Marcus!
Matthew, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, so am I. Thanks, Aubrey.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I want to get into, and of course we have an audience for most of the listeners, we've talked about psychedelics for a long time, especially from an experiential standpoint. You know, I remember first getting on Joe Rogan's podcast in 2010, even before my podcast was really going, telling about my first ayahuasca experiences. And I've been just talking openly about my experiences with some of the greatest healers, and then my own personal journeys and vision quests and all of that. So the audience should have a fairly good understanding of the psychedelic experience. And, you know, what I'm curious about and what I really love about getting with a researcher like yourself is to start to understand the mechanisms a little bit better. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is the breadth of knowledge that you have about multiple different psychedelic compounds, and try to merge a deeper understanding of what's happening in the brain with what's happening experientially. Because it's all too easy to either go one side or the other, to just, it's all energy medicine. It's not dose dependent. It doesn't matter. Have a thimble of ayahuasca or have 2 cups. Well, a beautiful sentiment, but I will fucking tell you, a thimble is different than 2 cups. I don't care what the energy's like. And there's certain times where 2 grams of mushrooms feels like 10 grams, and sometimes where it feels like, did I take something? You know, like, so there is some truth to all of this, but I think really the magic is in merging both. It's the handshake of the experience and the actual science and mechanisms, and also the exciting research that's coming out for treating, you know, actual conditions and making a really positive impact on the world.
Yeah. I like that way to put things. It reminds me of Terrence McKenna, one of his quotes, if you're not seeing the aliens yet, you just need to, like, up the dose. You know, like 2 cups, might be some weak tea.
Right.
Yeah.
There is.
I mean, dose is a real thing.
It's a real
thing. No matter
thing.
what else is involved, the number of molecules, like, pounding those receptors makes a big difference.
It's a real thing. It's not the only thing, but it's a real thing.
Right.
And it's a yes and kind of world. And I think people get lost in this. Other people in the same way say, oh, it's just a drug. It's all in your head. Yes. And maybe you're tapped into something that's beyond what's just in your head. Or maybe your head is also inextricably part of everything anyway.
Right.
So you're actually saying the same fucking thing.
Yeah, everything we know is in our head.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the first Hermetic principle from the Kabbalion, and that Hermetic wisdom that comes, as the legend says, from Hermes Trismegistus, who's known as Thoth in Egypt, and then all the way through Hermes in Greek and Roman. The first principle is all is mind, the universe is mental. Right? And I think that's an important thing to understand and grapple with, and not even talking about the ontological correctness of this, because we're all in the realm of linguistics, but to understand everything as the same substrate.
Yes.
Call it mind, fine. Call it whatever you want. But to understand everything is participatory in the same substrate is pretty important when we're talking about these medicines. Yeah.
That's the framework I like to have. I mean, including, when you're in the psychedelic realm, one of the cool things is it just bridges everything, disciplines of science, like sociology, the humanities, philosophy, art. And one of the things I like to say is, often you butt up against the supernatural. And I think it's important to keep in mind, a good amount of what we call the supernatural now we might be calling natural in 100 years, 5 years,
Right.
5,000 years. It's like, what would they have called magic? Could they only have called magic 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Most of the stuff we're doing now. So just this presumption that to keep your boundaries open enough, not infinitely open, but like, in terms of taking things seriously and evaluating them, don't just sort of dismiss things because you don't have a current mechanistic understanding of it. It may be that that's what we're going to discover
Coming up.
Yeah, maybe next week.
One of the things that Dr. Zach Bush shared recently at Arcadia in the speech was that right now there's a categorical and systemic dismissal of magic and miracle, because he's worked in the clinic for a long time. All right, someone has stage 4 cancer, tumors and all kinds of things, and all of a sudden something shifts in their mind, some experience happens, some mindset shift, it all goes away. And what you write on the chart, spontaneous remission, right? Like, this is some statistical anomaly.
Yep.
And he's like, yeah, maybe, or that was a miracle.
Yeah.
Like, that was a miracle.
Right.
But you can't write on the chart, miracle. It's like there's a name to exclude, and kind of even the placebo effect itself.
Oh.
Right? It's like,
Yeah,
let's just make this annoying thing that we have to account for in clinical trials. They're like, oh no, this is the magic of thought changing matter.
Yeah.
How about that?
You control for it.
Yeah, exactly. Control it out of the way.
We're not interested
this
in that.
annoying thing called the placebo effect that's proving over and over again
Right.
that thought changes
that we have
matter.
this miraculous, like,
Right.
Yeah. Another Terrence McKenna quote. It's like, science is big about, dismissing miracles, but like, the prerequisite is that you got to allow us like one miracle. If you just, go back in time, it's like everything that we know came out of nothing for no reason instantly, out of nothing into everything. And it's like the rate limit of miracles. Like, can you come up with a bigger miracle than that? Like, that is the
truly.
definition. Every miracle you can name is within that.
Right.
So it's like, we got to be humble when we dismiss something someone might describe as a miracle. Doesn't mean you should give up looking for, observable mechanisms that might mediate that miracle. But it also doesn't mean it's not a miracle. If you've had a kid overcome a serious disease or something, it's like, you might explain the mechanisms. It's still a miracle.
Yeah.
Right.
And sometimes you just might not be able to explain the mechanisms. And at that point, don't just cast it aside. That's the point where I think everybody should look and almost bow.
Yeah.
And be like, bow to the mystery. And I think that's one thing that psychedelics offer is like, you have this humbling appreciation for the mystery where you say, whoa, there is something far greater than I could ever even grasp. And I'm going to look through my tiny little peephole of a window of my own perception and just get a glimpse of the mystery.
Yeah.
And
I think it's just I've said, like, it seems like people getting close to that mystery and observing it, no matter what answers they have, no matter what interpretation they take away, doesn't matter. It's just that engagement with the mystery. And I think about it in the context of our daily lives compared to maybe, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000. It's like where every night you looked up at the stars and were like, what the, now, like so many of us, when's the last time you've really done, it's like this kind of the kind of the miracle is kind of like, sucked out of, the world for us, that kind of like exposure to nature. So it's like people just being confronted with it. If they come out with a completely naturalistic explanation, that's like, well, look at the amazing nature of the physical world. Even at that level, it's like jaw dropping. If it's some religious interpretation, other spiritual, no matter what it is, it seems like there's something with just grappling with the big questions. That if you don't even think about no matter what your answer is, if you don't think about the big questions, something's going to go off.
Yeah.
Like, we're not designed to be divorced from those big questions, it seems.
And this is, I think, part of the problem with, I was a philosophy major in college, right? And I loved grappling with the big questions, but you have to weed through a lot of really annoying philosophy to get to the good stuff, right? And most people are like, oh, I fucking hate philosophy class. And I get it, because they're not actually engaging people. It's more memorizing what some other philosopher said and comparing that with the memorization of what another philosopher said, and not actually getting you to philosophize and actually getting you to grapple with the questions until you get to higher level, courses and better teachers. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right, now let's figure this out together. Here's some theories. What do you think about this? What do you think? And I think that teaching that early, that was a major cornerstone of education in ancient Greece for a long time. It was like, how do you get your mind to grapple with questions? Whereas right now it's about how do you memorize what other people have grappled with?
And science seems to be the same way. I don't remember a single time in high school in like chemistry or physics where it was more than, I learned a good amount and appreciate it, but it's like in chemistry class, it's just like you're following the cookbook.
Yeah.
It wasn't really the level of like, before this was in a cookbook, someone figured out like, what do we do to figure something out? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we figure out how to turn something into something else? Like someone had to do that. And so you just don't get much, if any, of that sort of like, this is what the science actually is. Science isn't following a recipe. Sure, you need to do that for science, but the most important science is what you did before there was ever a recipe. You came up with the recipe. And then if it's science, other people should be able to follow that and get roughly the same results. But like you're saying with philosophy, same thing. It's like it's not about memorizing facts. It's about philosophizing.
Yeah, doing the thing. Same with poetry, right? Like you can read a bunch of poetry that you can hardly understand, or you can write poetry. And I've, one of the greatest poets alive right now, I believe, is a guy named InQ. His name's Adam. And I've watched him lead poetry workshops where everybody, like 90% of people will be like, I can't write poetry. Well, they're thinking they have to write in iambic pentameter, Shakespearean sonnet, or some other form or structure. It's like, no, just share the truth of an emotional thing that you feel, and it's fucking poetry. And watching people actually express poetry and be like, holy shit, I didn't know I could do this. And over and over and over again, every single person in the workshop being able to access that, all of a sudden their whole frame of poetry changes. And I think there's that invitation for all of the different arts and sciences to be like, this isn't what you've been told about it. There's a frontier here where you can explore and actually train your brain and also give you access to discovery and awe and wonder.
And that very much reminds me of sort of like stuff we deal with every day in society these days. It's like, what does trust the science mean? Does it mean trust these conclusions that are hopefully informed by science that you've been told science has come up with? Like, no, science is that. When you start to question something and think for yourself and then apply reasoning, well, I've seen this, there's some data here, what about this experience? Like, you're doing science. Just believing in what someone tells you is really in some sense the antithesis of science. I mean, you should listen, but if it doesn't square with your experience or from your own observations of data, then, what is science really? It is the process. What is philosophy really?
The discipline of asking
philosophers. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so, as you said,
being curious.
Trusting a conclusion is not trusting the science. It's trusting a conclusion, which you can. Sure. Like we don't have time.
You take the source into account.
Yeah, of course. And that's fine. But actually, science itself is a living, breathing thing. And I think it's almost like biblical thinking as well. Like, trust the Bible. That book was written 2,000 years ago and it's spot on. Well, all right. Well, look at it now. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Do we want to stone the person who committed adultery? No, we don't. It needs to evolve. And, it's like there's ways in which we can understand that all of these conclusions may have been relevant for a certain time or may have been, looked through a certain perspective, but continually always questioning and looking for the counter thesis to the thesis.
Yeah, it's all provisional. We're never going to fully capture reality. It's all a model.
Yeah.
So it's all provisional, and we need to stay open.
One of the things that must be exciting for you is there's been probably it's probably one of the most exciting frontiers to study psychedelic medicine, because that was actually stopped for a long period until finally the gates kind of got opened a bit, mostly recently, where now it feels like people can study most of these compounds in a clinical setting and get actual access to the medicines in a standardized way that you can actually conduct these experiments, and which really are the frontier of not only studying the compound, but studying the psyche, studying the body's ability to heal, it's giving us access to so many things. So it must be incredibly exciting for you to be doing science in the frontier where you're really in fresh powder in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, and to see that transition from 2004, when I first started doing psychedelic science, to now, you can't even imagine. Like, it just, the shifting, landscape. Folks legitimately, and folks that really cared about my future saying, gosh, Matt, what are you doing? Like, how are you ever going to get any funding in this? What's the future in this? Like, what is this? Is this real? Is this just wishful thinking? And to now, it's like I probably spend most of my time on the other side of it's not like a magic pill. Not everyone automatically gets better. So I spend more of my time, and there are risks. Be smart. But yeah, now it's at least being taken seriously. Which I don't know of another case in science where, like, for decades, things were put on complete deep freeze. It's like, stopping in the late 60s, early 70s, it's like, okay, I think we've developed a few things in science since then. It's like, most of our understanding of the brain has evolved, dramatically since then. Just our understanding of pharmacology and behavioral science and everything that's relevant. Like, where would we be now had those brakes not put on, if they weren't put on early on?
Where would the world be now? And it's a real travesty. Like, if we were going to look from the ultimate bird's eye perspective of everything, like, this was a catastrophic decision and unfounded too, really, from a scientific perspective, as we're seeing the safety data on all of these compounds actually come through. Like, all right, I understand. Maybe we should put a deep freeze on gain of function research for certain viruses. Like, chill, everybody. Maybe like CRISPR technology. I don't know. This is not my fucking field to talk about that, but it's like, this is risky. We don't want to get strange mutations out from a lab leak in the wild that can kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about when you're studying MDMA or you're studying psilocybin, right? It's not the same thing at all.
This stuff is, I often say, it's treated like nuclear material.
Right.
And I agree. There are certain things and categories that, like, we really, I remember, like, early on in nuclear, in the Manhattan Project, there was this idea. It's like, they weren't 100% sure that this just wouldn't start a catastrophic chain. We were just like, whatever, like, blow up the atmosphere of the planet or something,
Yeah, but meanwhile, they were like, fuck it, go for it. And they're like, but should we study LSD? No.
Yeah.
Put that on freeze.
Now, you could construct an argument that, like, sounds kind of naive. I don't know, that, like, oh, it's just going to warp the minds of so many young people. It's going to collapse society. But gosh, there are things like, you start talking about, like, pathogens that can cause pandemics and, nuclear weapons where the fallout, like, do we really know? Like, can we really model what a nuclear winter is going to look like? It's just like, we know it's going to kill a lot of people. Right. It's just, millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions. It's like, so there are things that are in that category of, like, yeah, because of the implications on humanity so widely, like, it's appropriate to put the brakes to say you can't do that, or if you do this, it has to be highly regulated, and certain things you can't do, or certain things you can. But this is not in that category. Not to say that there shouldn't be any regulation, not that there should, there's institutional review boards and the FDA and whatnot, but just this idea that no experimentation can be allowed for decades. The only experimentation was, high school kids, just, like, introducing it to each other in college, and other people. But understandably, like, that's where things, when you define something as illegal and not just illegal, but illicit, and there's Sasha Shulgin would point out the difference between these things. Just illicit. It's like, regardless of the legality, it is societally frowned upon.
Mm-hmm.
Like in some ways, I guess you could consider cannabis, regardless of the state, still illicit in the sense that, like, it's not looked at the way it's like alcohol and tobacco. It's still frowned, upon.
It's so interesting how this government, which is like has a magic wand, which bestows some this is legal or not legal, deeply impacts people's understanding of what the actual risk, reward, cost,
Right.
cost benefit analysis of this thing is, and
Yeah.
we've seen that with cannabis where it's like in a place where it's legal, now people are kind of like relaxed about it. Whereas before you were a druggie and you were a hippie and you're a pothead and now you'll get somebody in their 60s or like my wife's, I don't want to put my wife's family on blast, but but like whoever will just be like
the most mainstream.
Yeah, I'll have some.
Yeah.
Like sure. But then something that's about to be legal but isn't quite legal yet, like psilocybin, like, oh no, it's illegal, it's a drug. Like, what do you mean?
Right.
It's like it's if you really just look at it and think for it, and that's why I'm so grateful for the science that's already happened, is even those things that aren't quite legal yet, there's still this foundation of, no, this is the actual research.
Yeah.
And Johns Hopkins has done such a good job, not only on the clinical side, but also the experiential side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, were you a part of that study that was showing that like a certain high percentage, I forget the numbers, used to have them off the cuff, but a certain high percentage said that their psilocybin journey was their top life experience?
Yeah.
Can you
So
drop
was
into
some of
that
the
study?
Yeah. So we did, I arrived at when that very first study was wrapping up, but then I initiated, drafted, led the second study, which is a file looking at different doses, but same thing, like not treating a disorder, just saying we're going to take, highly functional adults who are in those studies, they were spiritual seekers broadly defined. So, given the claims about, religious, spiritual, what have you, broadly defined, these kind of, transcendental, again, there's a million words, different languages you could wrap around it, these extraordinary experiences, which touch on the big questions. It's like, okay, let's get some different people that have like, had some experience in those realms. Like they've tried a bunch of meditation and different services and like Sweat Lodge or whatever their particular like tradition is. And the results were extraordinary. About a third, and this has been replicated in multiple studies, but about a third will say it was the most meaningful and spiritually significant experience of their life. This is not like laying on a couch in a hospital in Baltimore. I mean, like, have people seen The Wire? I mean, that really says something, like the context. It's not like,
sure.
Yeah, but, and then even, and sometimes people be like, well, yeah, there's that, my marriage, I don't want to, God, I feel bad for putting that down to number 2. So, so it's also interesting to say, like, what are is it in the top 5? And then you get like 2/3.
Yeah.
Which is really impressive. It's like, yeah, maybe it's not one of the...
Well, I mean, I had kids that were born. I got married.
Yeah, my wife and kids are going to kill me if I
can't
like...
fill out number one here, but really secretly. Off record,
it's
number
really
one.
A 1, but if my wife asks, it's... But yeah, it's like, it's like most people, like, with prepper, and it's not random, it's not just taking a big dose, but it's taking and it is a big dose, to be clear. It's a heroic dose. In that case, 30 milligrams body weight adjusted. So if you're above 70 kilograms, about 150 pounds, and a higher dose of like whatever, 200 plus pounds, you could get, up to, 50 milligrams or so. So this is like 30 milligrams would be about what Terence McKenna would call the heroic dose. About 5 dried grams of psilocybe cubensis. So this is a high dose. So at that dose, you can get, not everybody, but 2/3 of the people will say this was one of the top most meaningful experiences in my life. And you could schedule that for next Wednesday. And that's the thing. And research has been done with these experiences, and we don't take these kind of, call it what you will, quantum change experiences, these like mystical experiences. Research, and it's not a popular area of research because it's so hard to really, you can't bring it in. It's hard to bring it into the lab and really study. And psychologists have been, like myself, have been obsessed with understanding behavior change for 100 years, but we're used to incremental behavior change. And we forget that the world is filled with these cases where people say, well, there was me before this experience and there was me after this experience. And the world's literature and mythology is filled with this. You know, Saw on the Road to
Initiation
Damascus,
rituals.
Ebenezer Scrooge.
Yeah.
Ebenezer rituals, it's like, now you're a man.
Yeah.
Or bar mitzvah or man, woman, it's
And now
a vision
all of
quest,
these rituals
like
have
whatever
gotten
the
pretty
tradition.
hollow and shallow, so we don't have that actually baked in our culture. But
Right.
you think of like 300, the wolf in the winter snow. It's like the young king-to-be Leonidas goes out in the cold in the fucking snow, and this is a fictionalized story, but he goes out there to confront the wild of the wilderness. This is a traditional vision quest, and come back. He leaves as a boy and comes back as a man. We used to have this baked in to our own culture where things would happen where you were dramatically different from one place to another. And at least for me, that was my initiation. That changed my life forever, right? I had a vision quest initiation with psilocybin and MDMA.
Wow.
Yeah, with a shaman who was actually, she was a part of the kind of Stan Groff crew and kind of went underground and that. She was unbelievably skilled. And she took me out to the mountains of New Mexico. I stayed in a yurt. I tended my fire, and I had the psilocybin tea in a capsule, probably 100 milligrams of MDMA. I don't know at that point what it was, but I remember it was a combination of both, and it completely changed my life forever. I was not the same man that walked into the hut, not the same boy that walked into that hut as the one that walked out, 2 days later.
Wow.
Like it was one of those different things that the Aubrey that everybody knows who's listening would not be the same Aubrey without that initiation. And it's not the only way. It's not the only way to do it, but it's one of the few ways that we can safely do this now that really could work.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing it as you said, on the medical side as well, like these initiatory transcendental experiences shifting everything. 3 sessions of MDMA curing PTSD in a high percentage of people, right? It's a whole new model.
Yeah. And one advantage of these techniques, and I should be clear, everything has risks, and I never encourage any drug use. And by that, I mean caffeine, you name it.
Likewise, it's a very personal choice, and that's important.
There are risks.
We should probably say that at least 3 times more during this podcast because it's
every
important.
3 seconds.
Yeah, for sure.
What I do.
Through my crazy travel schedule, I have learned that I want to travel light and effective. And one of the best ways to do that is to travel with all of Onnit's instant collection. Alpha Brain Instant, New Mood Instant, Hydratech. It's super easy. All you do is you tear off the little strip here, you pour it in water, and you get the instant effects of these formulas that we worked on for a decade. Formulas that I don't want to leave home without, that can help in the case of Alpha Brain, get you more focused, put you in this productive flow so you can get the shit done that you want to get done. And of course, New Mood to help you relax, stay calm, stay centered. It's the great yin yang of the Onnit formulas. And of course, Hydratech, anytime you're sweating, working out hard. All of these are available onnit.com/Aubrey, and you'll save 10%. Once again, that's onnit.com/Aubrey.
But what I say is, relatively speaking, and this is what got my colleague David Nutt removed as the official, essentially the drug czar in Great Britain years ago, when he said MDMA is even dirty street ecstasy, okay? Which, a lot of times, as we know, including research I've done, is not MDMA, or it's, mixed with plenty of impurities. Even dirty street ecstasy, no question, far safer than horseback riding. He wrote this tongue-in-cheek article. He called it equisy. He took the roots for horseback riding, and anyway made an ecstasy type. And made this very kind of humorous article about there's this new horrible drug. It's called, and he gave the same statistics for horseback riding. And you read this thing, and you're like, this is oh my God, Superman died 5 years ago, whatever, because of this.
Sure.
Back then, this is years ago he wrote this, but he's right. It's it's all these horrible statistics, and it's who would allow this? I just want to make the point, when we're talking about, compared to traditional cultures and just lots of traditional techniques, okay, go out and don't eat for weeks on end. Go out in the desert where you have to get your own water. You might die. There's a good chance. I mean, certain number of people don't make it. Like
Yep.
encounters with wild animals, it's like in the right setting, these techniques, they have their risk, but they are incredibly safe. I mean,
Yeah.
psilocybin is so much safer than going skiing. And again, I'm not encouraging people to do any of this. I'm not encouraging people to go skiing, or take psilocybin.
I
But
take
just
psilocybin when I go
objectively,
skiing. Actually, so I'm really running the risk profile high up. But I swear to you, I'm a way better fucking skier. I become the mountain and the snow
And
as
what
I'm
kind
skiing.
of dose? Like,
Usually like between a gram and a gram and a half. So on
okay,
the
a
lower,
sort of standard
on
potency.
the like lower side,
but
standard
not a
po-
microdose.
No,
That's a real
and
dose.
Again,
Yeah, that's
we have to be really careful here because a gram and a half of what they call the penis envy strain.
Oh, yeah.
Fuck
Oh,
off.
God.
No way.
Easily
I'm just going to melt
3
into
to 5 grams
I'm going to
of-
melt into
yeah.
the chair and be going up and down and up and down on the lift going like, I'm not getting off. No way. I'm getting off. Don't make me get off.
Uh-huh.
So it's, yeah, for sure. But these experiences that I've had, and of course I have a lot of experience, and this is not a recommendation to do what I do, but it's interesting, all of the biases that we have about this, like, oh, you're not going to be able to function or operate. I'm fucking telling you, I shred when I have a little psilocybin. And I know fighters who take like a little bit more than a microdose before they fight. I know a lot of people who experiment with these different compounds and actually get better, get more aware, get more tuned into their environment. And all of these ideas, it's just like, hold them lightly. Some of them may be right. There could be psychotic breaks. I've seen that happen, and of course, that's why MAPS has the Zendo project and why it's important to always be prepared, because this can trigger episodes that are scary and dangerous. And so to be very mindful, but also let's hold all of this propaganda that we've been told. Let's hold this lightly.
Yeah. And just think about things relatively. Think about the risks of swimming pools and and all manner of sport, and
all of the pharmaceutical drugs that exist.
Yes.
Like all of the other drugs
yeah.
were like, oh yeah, whatever, take his, benzos, all SSRIs, take them, go for it. And then there's people, like suicidality is a side effect, a known side effect of certain pharmaceutical compounds.
Yeah.
Homicidality is a side effect of certain, I think it was what was the smoking cessation?
Yeah, varenicline, Chantix. Was
Chantix.
the brand name. Yeah.
Homicidality is a side effect. What the fuck?
Yeah, I was hearing anecdotes about that even, before the black box warning and that. Yeah, like just these weird stories that you wonder, has that made it into any medical file? Like someone that a relative's, coworker's sister, this type of thing.
Right.
But yeah, like killed his son. Like it's like you just wonder how much of this is actually getting, getting into the analyses. But yeah, these things have, pharmaceuticals. That's a good point, because it's like in the context of medicine, not just, having, extreme experiences, but it's all risk-benefit ratio. We give drugs that we know cause motor damage, like say for, schizophrenia, but sometimes that's the only thing that stops someone from having an absolutely hellish life with the voices that, and it's like, well, yeah, we do our best. And it's like, what's the path forward? It's risk-benefit.
And
it's
just
like this
looking
might
at
have
that
risks,
science.
but
That's science, actually, looking at everything without the biases, without the narratives, without all the stories, and actually listening to people who have experiences. Recently, I just had Aaron Rodgers on the podcast, and he's, quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, won a Super Bowl. Last 2 seasons has been the MVP of the league, right? And so a lot of ideas about what would happen if you did psychedelics. Well, and I told this story, and, I encourage people to listen to the podcast with him when telling the story. But the first time I met him, he listened to me do a podcast with his girlfriend at the time, Danica Patrick, and finished the podcast. And he pulls me aside and he's like, I want to tell you about one of the best days of my life. And I was thinking, fucking Super Bowl, I don't know, like national championship, MVP, something. I was figuring like some football related thing. He's
triumph.
I took mushrooms for the first time on the beach, and I merged with the ocean. And it was one of the best days of my life.
And no championship ring. Like,
yeah.
what?
And I was like, damn, that's fucking cool. And it goes to your same study, right? It's like a life full of accolades and a life full of accomplishments and amazing things, the draft day and the Super Bowl and all this. And he's like, and I also wonder if for him it wasn't like, actually that was the best day, but I can't say that, but and so that like kind of started to form this initial friendship, and then he did ayahuasca for the first time prior to the 2020 season. And people would think, oh, you can't do that, or it'll tell you to stop playing football because football is stupid. It'll tell you all of these things. And then he goes out and he wins the MVP of the league 2 years in a row after that, right? And so finally, like he's telling this story, and I think I'm just celebrate him for the courage to share that story, because it's important to change people's perceptions to say like, no, this isn't always going to tell you to stop doing what you're doing and do something different or make you worse at what you do. It'll tell you that if it needs to tell you that, because it's you telling yourself that. It's some knowing that you have inside that this is unlocking. It's not like it has an agenda for you.
Right.
It's you telling you what to do. And if you want to play football better, it'll tell you how to do that.
Right. I've never seen a single person move to a cave in India to meditate the rest of the. I've never seen that. I'm not saying it has never happened, but
people are so afraid of that.
Right.
That's like one of these ideas that has permeated culture.
And spouses and partners. That's one of the things that struck me over the years, that oftentimes a spouse or partner will have this concern of someone going to do a study with psilocybin, and they're like, I've read about this stuff. It can cause personality change. Which is true, but one could hear that and think all kinds of like things. They're going to divorce me. They're going to move to some cave in India and sell our house, and I'm going to be stuck with the mortgage like that. Never seen that, Not saying that, of course, this is people without like tons of experience that are, having a controlled, prepared, integrated experience, So, can't say that's never happened, but some of the fears are just, they're out there, and we just don't see them.
Yeah, there's a disproportionate amount of actual stories versus the narrative story that it's going to happen. And I think that's what it's about. It's not saying this has never happened or it never will or never could, but it's just kind of starting to get everything in a more appropriate field of value. Yeah. So you understand that this is the realm of possibility. This is on the extreme aberrant outlier case. Yeah, it is possible, but that would come from, and I think the important thing that I always stress, that would come from you having that truly deep desire, and the fact that the reality that you would think about moving to a cave in India if you hadn't already thought about it and already been drawn about it, and as you close your eyes before you go into bed, you're already thinking like, I really wish I was a cave in India. To think that that's going to happen just because the psychedelics are going to tell you some message, no, it doesn't work that way. It's a handshake between your consciousness and the greater consciousness, and both are communicating to each other. That's why it works.
Yeah.
It's not a one size fits all. It's not like you go to the guru and the guru doesn't listen to you and just tells you what he wants to tell you. It's not fucking Zoltar.
Great reference.
It's a different thing.
I often think that when people get the best results, they have that orientation of there's an agency there. Like when someone says, oh yeah, I did the session and now I know what psilocybin does to you. Now I know what psilocybin is like. It's like, yeah, but no. The bigger story is like when someone really gets, slammed, like you get the full Monty experience, and their whole soul is shattered, and like they're just like, oh my God, like this is what I learned about myself. This is what I learned about the nature of the universe. This is what I learned about human. It's not about this is what this particular compound does.
Yeah.
And, that's a part of it, but it really fits with the old ad. It's like, it's just the key that unlocks the door. But what's behind that door, it's like, that's you, I mean, so it's, people have different ways to say it, whether it's just a, chemical, during a monkey wrench that into their brain that kind of allows somehow, greater access to their own psyche, whether it's some, a larger consciousness or what have you. It could be stated in many, many different ways, but when it really seems to work, it seems like there's some sense of it's something about you. It's something about you in relationship to the other, in relationship to the universe. You know, if one is religiously inclined, God, language again shifts, but like it's that you're at the center of it. And that's where the learning happens. And that's where it's like, it's not just like about what this drug does. It's about like what I am and what am I here to do?
Yeah.
And sometimes like people just have that context effect where it's like, they just keep going to they're backing up and they're getting that larger and larger frame. It's like they've gone through their whole life, habituated and kind of narrowed vision. And they're like, what do I really want to do? What's really important to me? What's, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I like to look at it is the body is like the repository of all kinds of information and data, and also possibility and proclivity. And, people can take it down the astrological route, or you can take it down the DNA route, or you can take it down all of these. But ultimately, we're a bunch of information that has been stored, and we're a bunch of possibility, our own blueprint of what we could be physically, our blueprint of what we could be mentally, and all of the ways, the factors, everything we've learned has created this kind of body of information. And then the brain is more like a receiver that's available to download new information and interact, and then also upload and share that information that you experience. And it's this kind of like two-way receiver. And these psychedelics tend to tune the receiver to a different frequency that allows access to more information from the body, so more that you're able to bring into awareness, and then more information from that which is outside of the body, that which is in the collective, because we're all participating. As I said, all is mind, the universe is mental, whatever substrate you want to call it, love, God, whatever. As a participatory agent, it's just opening up the brain to receive, different information. It's kind of like what Huxley was saying about how the brain is a cognitive filtering device.
Reducing valve,
reducing valve. And this opens up the Venetian blinds, and we get a little bit more information.
Yeah.
Both internally and externally.
And that's I've always loved that metaphor, because it's like, it also demonstrates why, like there are times when you shouldn't use, like you're trying to cross the street. You don't want those blinds all the way open so that like you can't navigate across the road. I always think, it's, someone could be, tripping on acid shrooms in the, ayahuasca, whatever, it's like in a busy city, and they're just like staring into their hand. It's like, my God, that's a miracle. Just like the hand is a miracle. And then that Mack truck comes and runs you. It's like, well, that's, from a certain perspective, that's a miracle too. But like, you really die.
Yeah. And this is not just like, this happens. This happens. I took a heroic dose of mushrooms out in California. It's a beautiful setting in the day. And I started looking at the way my skin wrinkled over my knuckles, and how it formed this pattern from all of the times that my hand is clasped and unclasped. And I was like, holy shit, this is the record of everything I've grabbed ever in my life.
Millions of times.
And I was like, wow. And this was 20 minutes of me doing that. Not appropriate for certain situations to be doing that.
But when you've carved out the right setting where it's safe to have that deep, deep contemplation,
And then you'll never look at your hand the same again.
Yeah.
You'll be like, thank you, hand.
And the ripple effects, like, maybe that's like affords a little more empathy when you're passing the construction workers, and like, man, they're working their asses off, and it's 103 degrees here in Austin, and they're working with their hands all day. It's like, yeah, you can spread that kind of like that empathy. It's like, and everyone has a hand, and there's billions of hands.
Has that been something, empathy seems like something that would be so important right now, because we're so polarized, we're so divisive in our culture. And I don't want to say that for everybody, because there's a lot of people who are holding a really beautiful unity consciousness as well. So I don't want to also exacerbate the issue by claiming that this is the only thing that's happening, because there's also a counter movement to real inclusiveness. But there is a lot of polarization. Has anybody studied the, empathy? Because this is important. Like, obviously treating depression, all of these things, this is what makes a drug legal. And we got to help ourselves really first before we can serve others. I have an organization called Fit for Service. The idea, in order to be of service, you have to be fit for service. I get all that. But also, we need to, be good gardeners and stewards of society as a whole. And empathy for others is like pretty fucking important if we're going to make it through this next stretch. And I know that MDMA has been called an empathogen. You prefer entactogen, and I like that differentiation. But I wonder if that's been studied. Has anybody run a study on empathy?
Yeah, and this is, these are, as you could imagine, hard things to study. What it
Sure.
looks like MDMA does in some sense, and it's been critiqued in terms of whether you can really call it an pathogen for this reason, or it's or calling into question whether it has reliable effects on empathy, is that it seems that people, it's not like they're more accurate. Like when you're looking at photos, the photos where the person is like, that's an angry face, the type of thing we have in common with the chimps and whatnot. It's
Sure.
like, that's a smile, that's an angry face. And there's tasks where you identify those emotions, and then, on the number of the milliseconds that it takes you to recognize that emotion on these photos, and how quickly they can flash, and still allow you to process. That's some measure, it's thought, of empathy. And so with measures like that, it would
But it doesn't mean it doesn't bring the feeling. It just brings
right.
the awareness.
Right. And how does that to relate to if you saw someone like really asking you for help on the side of the street in a tough spot, like whether you're really going to help them? I'm with you there. But even with that measure, it seems like MDMA more like gave people rose-colored glasses. It's sort of like they actually they interpreted some of the negative emotions as positive emotions.
He's just going through his process, and it's beautiful.
Right. And so maybe in some sense it's functional in certain situations. Also, you don't want to be a sucker and, get, hoodwinked into something. But yeah, like it may be. Now, of course, that's MDMA. We know that. So there's some question about whether it's at least reliably affords it. If you define empathy as really honing in, meeting that person where they're at and understanding their emotion, rather than assuming that there's something more positive going on than there really is. Of course, we could get very philosophical. Maybe you're seeing a deeper layer and seeing the positivity underneath.
Yeah.
But psilocybin, one of the things that, again, isn't like exactly empathy, but it's related. There are these interesting tasks that you do on a computer that kind of simulate this game of like just playing ball with just three people playing ball. I'm throwing to you and you're throwing to me, and there's this other guy, and like we're just leaving him out. So this is like me, the last person to get picked when I was in grammar school. I was like, it's like social exclusion task is what it's called. So, and like in cyberball, like where you model that, where it's really not other two people, and that's being modeled by the computer. We're just seeing how you respond to being that out person. So it seems like, psilocybin allows people to deal with, they're less likely to be hurt by being the out person. Doesn't sound that dramatic in the scheme of things, but the research is in its infancy.
Well, what are all the shooters? What's the commonality between all of these? Not all. I can't say all. That would be a mistaken.
But you would think.
But many. It seems like they were a loner. They were outcast. They were bullied. They felt separate from. They were playing this big social game of cyberball in high school, which we've all participated in to some degree, whether we're conscious of it or not, either as victim or perpetrator, or sometimes often both. Yeah. And
then the walls go up.
Yep. And then the ability to deal with that, and the ability to understand that, and the ability to understand on the other side, I think it just feels to me like it's a big area that could maybe, even just talking to you, like that it hasn't quite, nothing has quite nailed it. From a scientific standpoint, it seems like if we could really find and drive the right study to show this, which would have to be some kind of subjective measure of how you feel when you looked at somebody who is experiencing something hard. Because I remember the first time, so of course, my very first psychedelic experience was, as I said, MDMA and psilocybin. And it's a blended experience, so it was its own thing. But the first time I did MDMA by itself, I was in Australia with my girlfriend at the time. And I remember we walked by, and my heart's just blasted open. And it was like, oh my God, this is the best feeling I've ever felt in my life, walking down the street. And I watched a girlfriend was having a fight with her boyfriend. And boyfriend, said something mean, and she just sat down. And it wasn't like a violent fight or anything, but she just sat down and started crying. And I remember walking by her, and I was like, oh my God. Like I could feel her pain in such a way that it was like, I could just feel every bit of it.
Yeah.
And that experience is normally I would just walk by and be like, wow, it's some drama, like poor girl. But I wouldn't let it land.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's an importance for that, for dealing with people's fear or their pain or their struggle. Because we can get all too complacent with this, I don't need to feel what everybody else is feeling. I think it's important to feel it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of hard to imagine an issue with the world where that's not kind of at the core. That's at least not a part of it, just labeling anybody like someone from another culture, someone from another political team or a different idea on a certain issue, just to throw them away. I mean, it seems like we're really easy to do. It's easy to do that these days.
Yeah.
Just like trash someone on Twitter, just try to cancel somebody over, something minor, just to really go for the jugular. And it kind of takes this sort of like, you can't do that. Like if you had that experience for that lady, if you were feeling that, even if there's something, some legitimate beef, it's like, it's hard to imagine someone going that far in so many cases if they have some sense of like, that's a human, to just really kind of contemplate that, like, then I don't know, speaking for myself, it's like, a situation like that, like, oh my God, how many times have I made, a partner, cry, like, how many times have I been insensitive? And it's like,
totally.
How, like, this is the world, like, we're all, that, and sometimes people with psychedelics do have these profound experiences where they just feel this kind of universal, like, suffering, and they kind of empathize with it, and like, it's hard, to just take that in, and like the amount of suffering that we cause each other, but then, to move away with that with some, if one is left with more empathy, like what an incredible thing. Now, although I have to say, I've seen so many examples where, psychedelic fans, psychedelic aficionados, psychedelic research, you name it. Like, I don't see much evidence that psychedelics in general are making people better people or more ethical people, or at least it's so noisy that that's a tough correlation to pick up on, if you get what I'm saying. Like,
right.
Because there's, so many people that are just like, in where it seems like, oh, maybe too many psychedelic experiences or the wrong type of psychedelic experiences have magnified the ego, if you want to put it that way.
Sure.
And so it's a really, I don't know. I that's something I'm really curious about in the future. Can we really use these as technologies? Not that it's the only thing. I'm with you. It's like, but could it play some role in kind of training people? I mean, Tim Leary back in the day was interested, like, could we reform serious sociopaths, like people who have committed murder and whatnot? And this is the Concord prison experiment. And turns out there were some methodological flaws in that study, as Rick Doblin has found retrospectively. But nonetheless, this idea of like, could you really use this as a technology to reform people that are really struggling? Like, what if we catch one of these young people somehow with the signs that would go on to be a shooter? And could there be a crash course and it may not be psychedelics, but something, or maybe psychedelics are part of it, but like, can we really have a powerful technology? And I don't know, like, it wouldn't, I think my gut tells me it's certainly not psychedelics alone. It would have to be a very judicious way of using them.
Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, like MAPS is doing,
Right,
it seems like so much of the perpetration of harm on other people comes from trauma.
Yeah.
Right. Really. I mean, like, where it's like hurt people. I think that's a truism that's actually true.
Right.
Where there's some deep pain that's in there, and showing the efficacy of MDMA in treating trauma. I think that's one definite way that I think we could reduce a lot of the issues. And then there's also potentially that other side of allowing someone to step into empathy. Like, I could imagine, if I was going to study something and I just had a magic wand and I would say, like, what would be interesting to me would be, let's say, a murderer, and they have to listen to, often in court, they have to listen to the victim's family express what they're going to express. Yeah. But if they created that situation where that murderer was on, I don't know, give him a whack of a dose, maybe 200 milligrams of MDMA, and like really had to hear those tears with their heart blasted open. Like, what happens then? How's that experience? How does that land, and how does that shift when they actually can't block it off from their own pain and their own callous and their own bias and all of this other stuff? Like, would that land in a different way where actually you could trust them to be rehabilitated, and we'd move from purely a punitive model to actually a rehabilitative model?
Right. That's such an interesting question. I mean, because there are these stories I'm sure you heard of where, and I'm sure it's like the small minority of cases where like that person, without the MDMA, where that person's, and then it's like these murder, the victim's parents or whatever. There's a number of these cases I remember over the years, like, and they like visit the person once a month and they become fast friends, and like, just like these amazing things. You're like, my God, like on all sides.
Human heart. Yeah.
It's like on the victim's family side to like have that radical forgiveness and openness, and on the other person's side to really make it. I mean, they can never correct what they've done, but to like to transform. And so if that's 1 in 1,000, because I know these things happen, and it's like, and the victims or the accused is probably like rarely open enough. I mean, they're scared for their life. They're like, maybe, the natural human defenses, whatever the situation, they felt justified, or just at the individual level, or just society was so like whatever mean to them, and it's like, they don't give a shit. At whatever level it is, the guards are up. But like, what if you could like just knock them down in that one, and you don't have to do it the whole life, but that one moment where then the floodgates come in. It's like,
totally.
Those type of experiences where you can't come back from. It's not like you can forget that.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting
really
idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want to force the accused. You got to, to take some substance.
Consent.
You get to weird places there with civil liberties. But like if someone, and a lot of people would probably be open to it, but like, just at the level of shit, get me high before like this is hell. Like I'm about to go to prison the rest of my I'll take whatever. Like, sounds fun.
I mean, it's interesting to explore. I think as we transition into the more beautiful world, where I truly optimistically believe we're headed, and I believe the psychedelic renaissance is playing a bigger part in that than people understand. The algorithms look bleak if you don't account for some of these changes that are happening on the fundamental consciousness level because of this psychedelic renaissance. All the people who are going to be going in to treat their depression or treat their PTSD or treat their, addiction or treat this thing, and all of a sudden their heart opens up and they have contact with the divine and see themselves as part of a interconnected web and see everybody as them living a different life. Oh, and by the way, they help their depression or their anxiety and their thing. But the side effects are so potent in the positive way, potentially. And this is not, again, universal, but in the aggregate, I think we're going to see some big, big shifts that are going to come, that are going to start to change the algorithm quite significantly.
Yeah, I love these stories, and often from I do this line of research where we use psilocybin to help people quit smoking. So just tobacco smoke, which, as many people know, is as serious addiction as they come.
Mm-hmm.
But at another level, it's like, oh yeah, it's just quitting smoking. Like you're not doing anything that's going to get you locked up in prison, and your spouse probably hasn't left you over it, even though it's hardcore addiction. But like, even though we warn people, it's like, this isn't just about quitting smoking. Like you undergo a high dose psilocybin session. It's like, don't be surprised if you revisit trauma that you had in your past, that you wrestle with deep seated psychological issues, maybe just existential fear, like, or anything like that thing deep down in the basement of your mind that you don't want to share with anyone, that you're guilty about, that you're afraid of, what have you. Like that thing's gonna get out, like or it could, not necessarily, but like, dude, don't count on that thing staying put. Like, we are blasting out the basement.
I can just see them like giving their account to you researchers and giving this long report of their mystical experience, unio mystico, their apotheosis with the divine, and then you being like, what do you feel about smoking? And they're like, oh yeah, fuck that, that's crazy. I don't want to do that anyways. But it's like as like this thing, like, oh yeah, duh. Like I'm not going to do that anymore. But let me tell you more about I was fucking speaking to these beings. Like I have to tell you about this.
Right. We definitely see that. And even though we try our best, it's almost like just doing the study. It's like setting yourself up for that. Even though we let people know, still they're like, it just like really, as you said it, like that could be a quote from somebody. They're like, dude, really? Like you're gonna ask me about smoking? You know? But often they're like, yeah, oh yeah, totally. And I'm done smoking. And how the hell? Why would I want to smoke with like?
Yeah, life
whatever.
is far too magical.
It's like at so many levels. One just like, dude, this is so interesting. Like how how could I even be interested in smoking? Or just like life priorities. Like I don't know, why would I want to do that? You know, and it just seems like things like solidify. But, you know, sometimes you get folks where they still struggle, so they haven't quit smoking, but yet you see these like amazing life transformations where they say, oh gosh, I'm getting along with my parents better than I ever have, you know? And it's like, and we got to record this person as a failure.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
But no one's a failure, to be clear. But, you know, as not a success, you know?
Sure, because that's the nature of the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about mechanism of action, because I think this is interesting. So there's a lot of compounds, psychedelics and otherwise, that are actually not really so much psychedelics, but a lot of drugs and medicines too, that are interacting on the neurotransmitter level. So MDMA, for example, serotonin system, dominantly, little action with the dopamine system.
Right. Primarily serotonin, right?
And cocaine, mostly dopamine.
Yeah, dopamine. Noradrenaline, but mainly dopamine.
Yeah,
doing the magic.
And then alcohol, GHB, mostly GABA, right?
Right. Correct. Yep.
So that's
and same thing with all the benzos, Ativan, not Vicodin, it's an opioid, but Valium, Librium, etc. Xanax.
Yeah. The cholinergic, like acetylcholine, upregulating that was actually, so our flagship product for On It, Alpha Brain,
right,
was, really actually targeting that as a primary neurotransmitter, certainly. And we did that with, different cholinergic compounds, acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, and, different things that come from Huperzia serrata, which is this club moss in China, and some cool things like alpha GPC and different ways to upregulate that, help people get sharp. And it's actually very similar to kind of a nicotinic receptor. Acetylcholine and nicotine are kind of similar, and just creates sharpness and mental acuity.
Yeah, the nicotinic is a subtype of acetylcholine receptors. Absolutely.
Right.
That's why nicotine is such a, separate, as you've written about, is separated from the tobacco, especially tobacco smoking.
Sure.
Is like, it enhances. It's one of the few compounds ever that we're really sure, and probably we know more than any other compound, enhances, like, it's a nootropic. I mean, it really enhances learning, not just combating fatigue, like amphetamines and other stimulants are great at, like if you're so tired you're going to fall asleep and you need to study by staying up. Yeah, amphetamines and, all the stimulants, they work great for that. But in terms of truly, if you control for the time spent on task, something that truly enhances learning, I don't think there's anything more solid than nicotine. So anyway, like acetylcholine is like, so critical to learning.
When we ran those two studies with the Boston Center for Memory and showed, executive function, peak alpha state, showed some statistically significant improvements, duplicated that study twice. So there's some cool things that happen, and then also some very pleasurable things that happen from neurotransmitter modulation. And I think this is kind of like one of the first classes of different substances that we're really kind of drawn to. It's like in some way, it's just shifting the composition and availability of our neurotransmitters. Yeah.
So the acetylcholine system is interesting. Some of the drugs called hallucinogens have anti-cholinergic effects. So it's like scopolamine and atropine. This is in like Jimson weed and all kinds of like belladonna and a lot of ancient herbs that have been used since ancient times and in modern day, but have never been outlawed because not too many people use them regularly.
Because they're a little uncomfortable. A lot of those are actually associated with different forms of what would be called brujeria, or like sorcery or witchcraft.
Oh, yeah.
because maybe in just thinking about it, if the acetylcholine system is helping keep you focused and on task and sharp, if you completely downregulate that, you're going to be like, what? I'm
completely
soup.
dissociated.
Like, yeah.
And in fact, remember Sasha Shulgin, the famed psychedelic chemist, he referred to these as the true hallucinogens. As and many people know that, the classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, aren't, they don't cause hallucinations, which a key to that definition is that you actually believe the thing is there. Like you see the pink elephant and you think a pink elephant is there. Now, these anticholinergics, those are true hallucinogens.
That's the one thing I actually, as you make that definition, I've had so many visions. I mean, from spaceships to fucking dinosaurs to whatever you want to. I've talked about all my visions, demons and angels and the whole gamut of everything you could possibly imagine. But I've never had a hallucination because I've never believed that they were real. Well, real in the spiritual sense, right? Like
this
they
gets
were
difficult
real in a
to
non-dimensional
talk
way,
about. Right?
But not actually real.
If we were, even if you may not have been able to talk at the time, but if we said, Aubrey, like, do you really, really think it's like, at least in this consensus reality, like, is it really in the room? You'd probably like, no. Like, yeah.
I didn't nudge my buddy and be like, do you see that spaceship that was beaming that light underneath my tongue? No.
Yeah.
Even though that was real as hell.
But there are these stories. So I think you're a Ram Dass fan, right? Like he wrote in, was it Be Here Now? Might have been Be Here Now, or might have been another one of his books, like The Only Dance There Is. But he relates a story of I think he and a buddy, Ralph Metzner from the from the Harvard group back in the day, and he said they were at a hotel, a meeting, a conference or something, and Ralph was in his room, and they were on one of these compounds, some experimental, like highly potent anticholinergic hallucinogen, and someone from a lady from the hotel itself somehow came to their room and offered them lemonade. Don't ask me why, but or water, some liquid, and she filled up his glass, and it filled up the glass, and then it overflowed to the floor. And he's like, "This water keeps flowing. It keeps flowing," and like it actually raised up in the floor and like raised it all the way to the room, filled up, and went up to him and Ralph's like necks, and they're like, "Oh my God, I guess the lady had like left," or what? and he was like, "What's happening?" And I don't know, all of a sudden then the water started going down. Everything went in reverse and the water came back up into the pitcher.
Whoa.
And then he was like, "Oh my God, Ralph, did you just see that?" And then he realized like Ralph had never been there. And it was just like by himself the whole time. So like even these like layers of coming back, like even like, oh, that person wasn't even there. And I think Sasha Shulgin relayed the story of like, some of his stuff in his books, it's like you're not sure whether it was him or a buddy of his, and he's clever. He was clever about that. But like, yeah, it's like those drugs. It's like you're driving with someone you thought was in the passenger seat, and you're driving into San Francisco, and he's lived in the suburbs of San Francisco, and you're having this half-hour-long conversation with him, and then you just realize he was never there, like. And of course, when kids usually have tried to like, smoke Jimson weed or like whatever, and very similar, different mechanism, but similar with Amanita muscaria mushrooms. Kind of a typical story. And the reason they never need to make these things illegal is that, you wake up a day later in the woods, having pissed yourself, and having no idea, no memory of how you got there. And you're like, I don't think I want to do that again.
I heard the whole Christmas myth about Amanita muscaria and how this was, for those who don't know, the whole Santa Claus myth, these jolly Siberian hut shamans with the rosy cheeks from taking the Amanita, and the reindeers who they would drink the piss. They would feed the reindeers the Amanita muscaria, and it would somehow take out the toxin that's in there. What is it, muscarol or whatever?
Yeah,
I don't know, whatever. There's a toxin that if you drink the urine. So they were with reindeers all the time, and then it was white and red caps, and this whole lineage that was told by Taro Isokaipola, who was on my podcast, and I looked into it. Rogan loves the story too.
That it influenced the whole Santa Claus, like the red and the white.
Yeah, and they would give gifts out of their bag, and they would be jolly because they were high as hell. And I think it does involve the GABA system, if I'm correct as well. Amanita does.
and multiple compounds, I think, ibotenic acid being one, mucimol, but it's this collection of various degrees of toxicity. And that's the thing, like that's where the classic psychedelics, like DMT and LSD, psilocybin, that's where they really distinguish themselves, because it's like most drugs at a high enough dose are going to cause psychedelic type effects, where your whole conception of reality in some way, shape, or form starts to unravel and radically alter, not just you're a little sped up or slowed down or relaxed. But the classic psychedelics do that at a dose that like are really safe physiologically.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to come to close to death. Like
you're
tobacco
you're not
will do
anywhere
that,
near
but
the
you'll almost die.
LD50. Yeah.
And so some of these compounds like that are a little bit further along that continuum. It's like
It's a little sketchier.
Yeah.
A little sketchier.
Yeah,
So I was I had a bunch of buddies who were we were all in this kind of psychedelic. It was like 2006 through 2010 kind of era where we were really just like exploring, like trying to figure shit out. But I was a little bit, I read a bunch about Amanita muscaria. So I had one of my braver buddies try it. You could buy them for free. And he took it and he was going through this experience and he was convinced that the Battletoads were here. And the Battletoads was an old Nintendo game, I think, or like arcade game. He's like, the Battletoads, what are we going to do about the Battletoads? I'm like, there's no Battletoads, man. And he was convinced. And like after that Battletoads incident, I was like, nope. I'm out. Like that was too real for me. You know what I mean? Like, it's crossed the line from vision. It wasn't like the Battletoads appeared and then they told me that I need to love myself more. So,
right. There was
there was no like message. It was like the Battletoads are here and we got to deal with it. And I was like, okay, I'm out. And I think, and also I've talked to people and I want to talk to you about this one as well. Like Salvia has created intense hallucinations for the people who I've talked to. So I've been like, ugh.
Actually did the first blinded study showing any psychoactive effects of salvinorin A, the active principle of Salvia divinorum. And we basically had them smoke it out of a meth pipe and went up to doses that were around 2 milligrams, which is a really high dose. If like 2,000 micrograms is normally measured in micrograms. Yeah. But yet people at the higher doses in our study were routinely saying that they were communicating with entities. I'm very, very different, but very DMT-like in terms of the intensity and the dissociative nature of it. And there are people that make where it seems like it could be therapeutic, and it has been therapeutic, and that there are like profound, insights to be gotten from it. I think those are kind of harder to capture, at least for your average person.
Sure.
If one is philosophically inclined, if one is a psychonaut that is used to these waters, like they're probably, and this is my personal assessment, there's no good data in any way, shape, or form on this, but my impression is that one can get, much like a smoked DMT experience or 5-methoxy-DMT experience, one can get sort of those deeper kind of insights from it of various types, but it's just a little harder for your average person to get because the main response is like, what the fuck? Like, just it's so overwhelming.
Well, I mean, if people want to just take my own personal feelings to, like, I have been on the psychedelic medicine past 23 years, and still, I look at those things and go, not today. Like maybe not, and never have. Just and probably. There's a deeper trust of myself in those realms. I just have so much trust with the classic psychedelics that I don't have after listening to the experiences and being there for my Battletoad, the Battletoad incident with my buddy, that I've just, and I don't really see a purpose for it other than to say, well, maybe I'll trust myself to go into a place where things that aren't real could appear real and see how I navigate that experience. But I would want, if I did that, I would want all of my best allies to be there.
Right.
My wife, who's an amazing medicine woman, my brother Kyle, who's like a deeply veteran psychonaut who's had incredibly intense, encounters with what he calls Wetiko, which is like the confusing, distorting darkness of the universe that has really had him pump his brakes significantly on any medicine because he's got stuck in different. And so there's caveats everywhere. I mean, Kyle was the bravest of the brave. He did a 30-gram mushroom dose, which kind of kicked off this whole thing. And, he's told his own story about this. And there's more story to tell as it's been 2 years and he's still unwinding some of these challenges. But for this experience, I'd want him there. Oh yeah. I'd want to call the Avengers. Allies. I'd want to call the Avengers. And maybe it would just be hilarious and we'd all just be laughing together. But if I got twisted, I would want Kyle, who's also a giant UFC fighter, black belt, one of my best friends in the universe. I'd want him to be able to just hold you. Hold me. I'd want all bases covered if I was going to do this. And I think that's, just allow that to be a lesson for everybody is even me with all of these experiences, there's still things that there's no fucking chance I would do them unless I had the very best of the very best there with me to cover my bases.
And there is, and I always want to be, cautious. I don't like being critical of folks, and so, but what I will say is that some folks might be looking at the other folks that take everything and they've done all of the alphabet compounds, they've taken 2CB fly and they've taken 5-methoxy DMT and 4-hydroxy DIPT and
people are taking notes, looking shit up as you say all these things. Here's my audience. Pulling over in their car, hitting rewind 30 seconds, and be like, I'm getting tips.
These are the interesting ones. Yeah, it's like to those people who haven't done all. It's like you don't need to be those people, and those people. I'm glad there's all types of people in the world. There's the extreme explorer. I'm glad there are people that push, that do the crazy, do the wingsuits. They jump off of.
Totally.
I don't want to do it.
Yeah,
me
neither.
I'm not even sure if I want to skydive. I might be open to that, but it's you see what I mean? Not everyone should be like that. And
absolutely.
And it's the other question is have you conquered and explored that whole range of experience that psilocybin can offer? And anyone that really has any idea, no, dude.
And the thing is it's like an endless, an endless lesson. I mean, even Don Howard, one of my great teachers, 50 years of serving medicine, particularly as a Wachumero, he's like, there's always a deeper layer. It always gets deeper. He still showed up to every one of his ceremonies, thousands upon thousands of ceremonies with Wachuma as a student, ready to learn. And he was the greatest Wachumero that I think, our contemporary era has ever known. He was unbelievable. He revived the ancient Chavin tradition and was really like a torchbearer for the really old way of the Wachuma Masada ceremony. And absolutely just stunning grandfather maestro, But he showed up every time as a student, ready to learn something new. And so, and he'd had his experience with these different compounds and different things, of course, just kind of peeking his head into it. But he was able to continue his path of learning and growth, just sticking with one and getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
Because there's so much there. It's an infinite amount. That's why it's funny to me when people are like, you're still doing psychedelics, bro? You haven't learned everything you need to learn? I'm like, no. I mean, the whole world, there's a whole universe to explore inside and outside.
Yeah. Especially if you take that orientation, it's more about you than it is about the other compound.
Right.
Or about the compound. I'd say, I always think of it as interaction between two entities. One is this molecule that, and one is and relatively simple, molecules are simple little things. You could just build Tinker Toys to represent their shape, right? And the other thing is the most complex thing we know of in the universe, the human brain, and the associated human mind. And so if that is an interaction between those two things, what is the heavy hitter? Well, the heavy hitter in that interaction is not the simple little molecule. In terms of creating that particular experience, it was, a part of it, but it's more about what was in here,
totally.
Than it was, about what was in that compound. And so, all that said, I'm glad people have, that people have created, like Sasha Shulgin I mentioned, and other, great chemist David Nichols. People have created all of these compounds.
Dave.
Yeah, and then that people like Sasha Shulgin have taken them and described what these are. I think that's important, but not everyone needs to be taking every compound. And it's Terrence McKenna wasn't a fan of taking like all of these. He said, yeah, these things, you don't know what, some of them, they're brand new. And it's like, what's it going to do in 20 years? He says, at least I know something about psilocybin. You could think about it also. It's sort of like, am I going to get in trouble with this analogy? It's like, like ladies or potential, partners. It's like, there's different models. There's the quantity model, but that's also, the quality.
Can you go deep? Can you go deep with one person?
Yes.
Versus
you know what it's like to be deeply in love with someone
shallowly.
for years and years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not, they're different. You can't say that there aren't benefits.
Or there's polyamory where you go deep with a couple. Different people. I'd say I'm a psychedelic polyamorous. Because there's like a few things that I'm really like deepening my relationship with, and it'll evolve. They'll go through seasons. There's like seasons where it's like, okay, and I'll get really clear guidance internally. Like, this is the season where you're here to explore this thing, and then eventually,
so like topics or no different compounds. Or you mean like
compounds were giving me access to a body of knowledge, and that internally, that it was like, this is your study, like this is your course of study is with this particular one for this period, and I think, and there's been some, and then there's been some where I've tried, like for me personally, LSD doesn't agree with me, not in a microdose, not in a macrodose. I've tried it multiple times, and it's like, feels slippery, feels like I'm on one of those endo boards where I'm all balanced, and all of a sudden I just go whoop, and then I'm smacked on like my back. I'm like, well, how did I get here?
The analogy.
I don't want to. It felt really slippery. Whereas psilocybin feels like a steady, like driving. Same with that. With like.
Would you? Some people have said LSDs. They'll describe it as too forceful. Does that kind of fit with your, or is not quite? Not trying to put words in your mouth.
It is strong. It's. I mean, I think the non-specific amplifier is also good. It just feels like it's adding a lot of energy to my own psychology, which is a little slippery in its nature.
You might have enough of your own energy.
I'm very watery, very fluid, and so and very captured by story innately. So like when I think LSD amplifies me in that deeper way, it's not that LSD is slippery, it's that I'm slippery, and it's making that inherent quality of me more active. You know, it's like when people say that cannabis makes you anxious. Like, no, it doesn't. You're anxious. This is just amplifying your anxiety. And I think it's pointing to like an inherent slipperiness that I have with, kind of thought patterns and stories and things like that. Whereas I feel like some of the other medicines I feel like I got an older brother or a father or a grandfather or a grandmother that's helping guide my experience and kind of keeping me in bumpers, like I'm in a bowling alley. And I got bumpers and I'm moving around, but I'm heading towards the pins of the insights that I'm looking for.
Right. Someone's keeping you from going off that cliff if you were to veer towards it.
And if I do go into some crazy dark gutter ball scenario, there's always a purpose for it. I've always come out of it. Whereas with LSD, I've come out of something like, I gained nothing from that other than I survived it. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't get shit out of that. Whereas on ayahuasca or whatever, I've encountered the world crusher who was negotiating for the soul of my father and all of these crazy fucking horrific things, stole my heart and gave me a fake one in return, and then was like, I was bargaining with him, and then the angels came and said, you can't get your heart stolen. So I was a whole drama.
Yeah.
But I finished that and I was like, wow, that was a hell of a journey. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah.
Whereas like with LSD, for me personally, it's just been like, why did we even do that? Where did we go? What was going on there, mind? Like, what did I learn?
Yep.
And this is just my N of one story of my own personal psyche, and that doesn't disclaim the incredible benefit that so many other people have gotten from it. But it's about know thyself. Know thyself and know how these things interact.
And maybe one day, through brain scanning, through personality questionnaires, through any number of, and maybe a triangulation, all of these things, we can say, oh no, psilocybin's the compound for you. And we know that because of the ratio of serotonin to dopamine in this area of the brain. Yeah, like whatever it is, like we could, and moreover, you need this, like you need 23 milligrams, not 25, not 20, 23, So maybe we'll figure out, and I think there's a good chance because people have strong opinions. But I mean, you name the compound, they're like, well, like I said, some people say LSD is too pushy. Other people will say, no, it's the exact opposite. Psilocybin is too pushy and LSD is more relaxed. It's like, well, I don't know if anyone really calls these things relaxed. They probably haven't done a high enough dose. But nonetheless, people say the opposite things about, and it's probably all true. Now, some of that might be, driven by placebo effect, which is, as we talked about, is this miraculous, response. So that's not to be, dismissed. But some of it might be very different differences, real differences, very real biologically observable differences in their brain, like you respond better to this compound. Just like for some people, aspirin works better than ibuprofen or vice versa for a headache.
Right. Yeah, everybody in their uniqueness. What is the mechanism of action for Salvia Divinorum?
So it's a kappa opioid agonist, meaning it activates a certain type of opioid receptor. If folks are thinking, oh my God, it sounds horribly addictive. We know about opioids. Well, those are all the opioids that we normally think of: heroin, morphine, oxycodone, which is OxyContin, Percocet, hydrocodone, Vicodin, you name it, and of course fentanyl. Those are all mu opioid agonists. That's their primary the receptor. So there's different types of opioid receptors, just like the classic psychedelics activate the serotonin subtype 2A, serotonin 2A receptor. Well, there's subtypes of opioid receptors. So this is a pretty pure, the Salvia Divinorum, the main principal active compound in it, salvinorin A, activates the kappa opioid receptor. So kappa opioid receptor is interesting because it seems to lead to similar sort of analgesia, but it does not lead to, the euphoric effects. The people have and companies have developed in the past compounds they're hoping to develop as analgesics, as new pain relievers that were less addictive, that have relied more on the kappa opioid system. But those have been sort of thrown out in clinical trials because, like, you're doing this clinical trial and this person's like, dude, I'm starting to grow wings here and fly away. Like, and literally, like, there's a paper that wrote that. I'm not making that up. Like, one of these exotic kappa opioid agonists is being developed. And so they cut the trial, or they reduced the dose, I think, in that case. But it's a powerful, and we don't really know why activating the kappa opioid receptor leads to these sort of extraordinary changes. It may be that a backdrop is, when we say what's the mechanism of action of this compound or that compound, there's so many, it's so complex. We can talk, what's the receptor that's hit in the brain? That's just the first domino in this, imagine one of the scenes where the whole room is filled with all those dominoes and goes up a bridge and they all knock each other over and it does a spinny thing and does this. It's like the brain receptor, that's just the first domino, which is a big deal. And then it's like there's questions about what are the signaling cascades within that cell, within that neuron, that makes it have this effect or that effect. Once the ligand, the drug, has attached to that receptor, is it going to make it less active, more active? But then there's its effects on other neurons, and then we're talking about ultimately the system, more of the systems level. So it may be that a key common action to many of these broadly defined psychedelics or hallucinogens are their effects on brain network dynamics, which is a fancy way of saying the communication or synchronization of different brain areas with each other. So one of the things that's been observed with psilocybin and LSD, and also with Salvia Divinorum, or salvinorin A, the main agent in Salvia Divinorum, is that there's these just massive differences in these communication patterns across the brain. It's less about this one particular area is more active or less active. It's more about, if you measure that activity or inactivity across the whole brain, that all of a sudden there's patterns emerge that weren't there before. There's communication. And that kind of fits with, now jumping to the phenomenological, the subjective, experiential level, where it's it seems like these things are boundary dissolving. It's I normally do this in my everyday life, but I don't realize how that's so disconnected with a life priority that I have, or this emotional aspect of my being, or this relationship. We put things into compartments and we get through life doing that. But it's all these, and even at the perceptual level, this, may be consistent with synesthesia, hearing colors, for example, this boundary breaking, this sort of the brain, acting communicating more with itself. So that may be, and then you have certain networks that become that are typically more active, that are engaged with kind of interpreting consensus reality, and then there are other, or that drive you to pay attention. They're active when you're paying attention to something, and then there are other networks that are dissolved. So it's just massive change, whether it's decoupling certain networks, making certain networks more active. But it seems like there's this radical change in the communication across the brain.
Yeah, which is why what basically, to summarize, the reductionist approach to understanding these things ultimately fails. And not fails, but it's
only a small piece.
It's a small piece of a more holistic approach, because psilocybin is interacting with the 5-HT2A receptors, but it's also shifting the blood flow in the brain away from the default mode network and into other areas of the brain, to a certain degree, right? So it's shifting the communication and also the energetic concentration in different aspects, in different parts of the brain.
And that might be similar to other compounds or others, and we don't know yet. It may be that if you do some super intense, just non-drug altered state of maybe that's the same thing that's happening with holotropic breath work when it's really working well. We don't know yet. We haven't done the study. So
which is crazy with all of this. And the thing is, the reason why those studies cost money. Studies are expensive.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best philanthropic causes out there is funding, studies that are studying these things, like what is happening during a holotropic breathwork experience or deep Wim Hof breathing, or there's lots of different practitioners. This is a big part of my own personal practice. And that hyperoxygenation, you get that. But what is happening that's causing you to have that deep cathartic experience? Where is it going? Is it from, is it your brainwave state? Because that's another also measure that we're taking a look at that's worth taking a look at, that's really interesting. And Joe Dispenza's done some work where his most advanced meditators, when they're experiencing contact with angelic beings and angelic realms, they're in super high gamma. Like super, super high gamma.
That's interesting.
And then one of the medicines that I've gotten the most value out of is ketamine in the last few years, learning a lot from utilizing that medicine, which is actually dropping your brainwave into, as far as I understand, more of a waking delta. You're getting more activity in the waking delta state. So it's like all the way at that frequency, there's some interesting information available, and all the way at the super high frequency, there's interesting information available. Like on ayahuasca, I felt what it felt like a few times, and also on NN-DMT, smoked in a different way. I felt like my head peeled off in an interesting way, like my whole head peeled off.
Yeah.
And my radio frequency was just open to a whole other dimension. And I wish I had, some kind of hookup on my brain that was measuring, like, what was my brainwave state doing then? Like, what was actually, why was that different than the other 25 times I did ayahuasca? Right. You know what I mean? Like, what happened? Totally. What happened? What switch went on in my brain with roughly the same compound that made this big difference? So I'm paying intuitively, I think brainwave patterns also have something, a big piece of this puzzle.
And I think in the big picture, like that's a huge point, like in moving forward with this science. Like, it's another form of reductionism. It's like kind of like something I said earlier. It's not about what psilocybin does. I mean, that's one way to put it. But like, what does the brain or you could say the brain, or what is the person? How does their behavior change after the psilocybin? Well, it's more of like maybe, what does the brain do after an experience on psilocybin when they're seeing angels, or they're having a bad trip, or they're just having this, like, they're dissolved into the nameless void, like, you name it. We can go on forever, different psychedelic experiences. Those probably all look very different. Yeah. And we're not there yet in terms of really, and it may be that there's more relationship on certain biological measures and in terms of therapeutic, outcomes between, say, a psilocybin experience of a certain type and an MDMA experience of a certain type, and just a life experience of a certain type, or a course of psychotherapy or meditation, or you name it, holotropic breath work, Wim Hof breathing, whatever, it may be like we're not our reductionist thinking thinks like, oh, the compound, that's the commonality. Like, well, clearly that's part of it, and that's kind of opening up a wider range of very extraordinary experiences. But there's probably something very different going on when someone, with these very different experiences. I mean, you could, like, sometimes people's like blood pressure, it's like, it's going up and the person's like, they're freaking out, like they're in a safe environment in the study, but nonetheless, it's one of those cases where you're thinking, oh, I'm glad they're here with me, rather than on their walking around, downtown Austin.
Right.
It's like where like, they're really, this is putting them in a very, vulnerable place. And then other times, people are like, oh God, I'm at the most peace, and their blood pressure is like the cool, as cool as a cucumber. And they're just like, same compound.
Yeah.
The psychology is different.
Yeah, and measures like the Heart Math Institute is doing about, like the electromagnetic field of the heart and heart-brain coherence. And there's so many different interesting things that would actually need to all be in play for us to really understand kind of what's happening here.
The full system,
and still, even still, there's going to be something that's part of the mystery. And, the mystery does not always let us look up her skirt. Like sometimes she's just like, no, get your hand out of my pants. I'm the mystery. You just behold,
Right.
Just be grateful for what you got.
Yep. And, I think just that's a humbling and realistic perspective in science in general. It's like, we're never going to, the menu is never the meal. These are all descriptions. We just try to come as close as we can. And whenever you think you've figured out 99% of reality and working on that last 1%, it's like, that's what they thought 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, we always think that. We always think that.
Yeah, so a little something left to the imagination is not a bad thing. I mean, it's job security if you're, a scientist or a philosopher or, so
how boring would it be if we got to the answer of all things and everything?
Figured it all out.
Yeah. He really wanted me to come out there, and they have some he wanted me to be one of the trial participants since they got. Oh. And I was like, I would, but it's kind of a long way to go just to do DMT.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'd like if he came here, I'm like, sure.
Right.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's
But it's kind of like a hike to get all the way to the UK.
Yeah.
But I'm interested to see his results. But it's not, to me, it's not as interesting personally, just because I don't feel like a compulsion to prove whether they are or they aren't.
I mean, how could you ever prove?
Yeah, and I think it's they're trying to create like. I think it's more like I want to show that they're real, and I'm like, well, they're real to me.
Yeah, and what do we mean? I mean, I'm kind of more attracted to like a Jungian analysis where it's like, I mean, like you said about UFOs, it's like, well, the interesting thing is that not really whether they're real or not. It's like the fact that like a lot of people in the world are reporting these things. Like that's a real thing. Like these experiences are real. And what's that about? So at a certain level, it's not I don't know. There is an interesting, kind of like you were saying, the brain waves of someone having an angel encounter experience. It's like, that's a real experience, no matter what the reality of the angel is or not. Yeah, like certain phenomena, like, speaking in tongues, regardless of what you think on the theological aspect of that, that's a distinct state. Something is very interesting going on.
Well, let's talk about this. So we just took a bathroom break. We may roll in with some of our commentary. We were just talking about entities and my kind of feeling of being like, I don't really, it doesn't really stress me out whether you want to think of them as real or not real. I know what those encounters feel like, and I know what the value of them are. Mm-hmm. And I just have a feeling for it. And it's not, I don't feel compelled to try and prove that they're real or not real, because I think you're in a paradoxical bind. You have to expand your kind of whole paradigm and your dimensional understanding of the universe and reality itself in an interesting way, which is a more complex kind of conversation. But the experience of contact with energies or aspects of self that are beyond what the normal is. I've had this with many of particularly my female friends and my partner, I will watch her access a being or an aspect of her or an energy where she can sing in a language that's a beautiful, impeccable language, or transmit in a language where my body, the cells of my body will understand it in a way. Like my best friend Caitlin will drop into this. And for her, it's like the story is more of like a Mother Mary type of energy. And it sounds like an Aramaic language, but even more ancient. And she'll be transmitting something and feeling this emotion. And I feel like she's talking to me about my pain and feeling my pain. And I just start fully sober. If she gets into this and her hand will be moving in this sign language and she'll be weeping and I'll start weeping. And that experience is fucking real to me.
Yeah.
And whether that's an aspect of her that's latent and part connected to another aspect of her that's in another dimensional reality of the unborn and undying part of her. And I think you really have to carve out a whole understanding of the universe to really even make sense of that. But for me, it's like, what did you feel?
Yeah.
What was there for you? Like what happened? And that, when that happens, for her or my wife, it's medicine. Like I just know it.
Right.
And I know that medicine is real. So to me, it's like, yeah, it was real. But the question of, was it light language? Is it a real language? Is it not a real language? Is it the expression of a frequency? Who cares?
Yeah. And I think we do a disservice in science when we do a lot of this, like we dismiss entire areas because of that, at least at that outer layer, like with that, like if you just think it's, implausible and it's not even worth your time to study an experience like that because clearly, like whatever, she's not channeling some Aramaic speaker from like whatever the one's interpretation might be. If you don't buy into that the idea that there's nothing interesting going on there, nothing therapeutic going, that's and gosh, like this is in part like why psychedelics were dismissed for so long, and I think why a lot of and why just kind of a general interest in things that are considered, broadly speaking, religious and spiritual aren't kind of taken as seriously because we get hung up at that ontological reality.
Yeah, exactly.
And as you're aware, it's like something interesting is going on here, no matter what your, whether it's like glossolalia, speaking in tongues, which sounds very much like it sounds like speaking in tongues, like the same phenomenon, maybe of a different variety. And like, what's happening in her brain? Like, is this, is there a genuineness that's pouring through somehow that you're getting from her in this kind of maybe more unfiltered expression, again, regardless of any overlay of, any other story around it? Like, it sounds like something very interesting happening there.
And the communication that's happening between my psyche and the other person's psyche, like it's happening in a magical way. Like I cannot dismiss. I would be gaslighting myself if I dismissed the magic of the experience. For example, I'll give a very, very recent example. So in my own explorations, and again, I don't recommend this, but I'm prescribed ketamine. I've also justifiably had my own battles with depression and battles with anxiety. Ketamine's shown some benefit of that. So, and Wonder Science has gone through the whole program and have my lozenges and et cetera. But I also use them for my own exploration, as I mentioned, and sometimes pairing with cannabis. And I've talked a bit about that. That's been a really instructive thing. And I got a clear message on, in a ketamine journey is like, okay, now explore this in combination with DMT. And it was the first time, after a couple years of, kind of deepening my relationship and with ketamine and it was like, okay, now, and I had never done this before, even though I have access to DMT. And, so I got access to DMT and I went into it and my wife was totally sober and the experience got kind of heavy. It got heavy.
You don't say. Ketamine plus DMT.
Yeah, it got heavy. And she was in the bathroom and she was just rummaging around, I don't know, getting ready for something. And I had my mindfold on and my headphones on and I was like, Valona! And she like comes right over and intuitively she kind of knew and she like put her hand on my heart and she started singing this Icaro. And she's never sung an Icaro before, doesn't know Icaros or whatever, but she tapped into this frequency of what the perfect thing. And I just pulled my headphones off and she's just singing this thing in this other language. I'm getting chills now thinking about it. In this other language, but in this tonality that was familiar from all the great shamans I've worked with, Maestro Orlando Chuandama, the Quechua tradition, and, Don Robert, and all of these great, Maestro Alberto and Maestro Hamilton, all of these different Icaros from the traditional, which, of course, DMT is the main psychoactive component in ayahuasca, but she just dropped into this frequency and offered this thing for me. And all of that density started to open up and the light started to pour through the whole experience. And so, like, what is that other than magic? Whatever it was magic.
If your brain was being scanned, it probably led to an instant and radical change in your brain function at who knows what level, probably many different levels. So yeah, I mean, is that not real? And
you'll never be able to tell me. You could line up all of the scientists in the world, and they could try to tell me that there's some, logical materialist reductionist explanation for it, and be like, interesting. Yeah. And it was magic because I was there. And like everything you're saying may be true, and what I'm saying may also be true, that this is inexplicable.
Yeah.
Like something happened in the mystery. And maybe, like you said, maybe in 100 years we would be able to explain it because we would understand the resonance field that can be created and the ability for someone to actually step into the energetics and actually transmute something through the energetics of a listening that happens to something beyond words and beyond just the obvious facial recognition of an emotion, like you were mentioning, like something deeper, a deeper listening, an older, deeper, more ancient and more futuristic, understanding of what's happening.
Is there some sort of sensitivity at a layer that we don't understand yet?
Right.
I think, again, we shouldn't just dismiss whole areas of inquiry, so all of the psi phenomena, whether it's, telekinesis and, remote viewing and all of this telepathy, it's, what if it's possible that there's some truth to some of this, at least, and it doesn't discount the idea that, 99.9% of fortune tellers are just whatever. They're good at reading faces. But, if there's a reality there, one could speculate, but it's not hard to speculate on mechanisms of the physicists talk about these multiple dimensions that we're not sensitive to, and the idea that
Quantum
space and time itself
yeah.
might just be our sort of GUI of interfacing with whatever reality really, really is, and I don't know, is there some, no, we shouldn't let sort of scientifically, we shouldn't sort of put a label on something and just, basically, call it magic and then allow that to be the explanation that ends our inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of science, that just creates a dead end. Like, one could still view it as miraculous and great, but and say I'm never going to figure it out, but I'm still going to work on figuring out what I can figure out. But that's what I think more of what we should. So it's is there a layer at some, was she perceiving something that, I don't know. I don't even want to put the word, because I don't want to pretend to know the mechanism, but something that is inexplicable to our modern mechanistic understanding in terms of knowing exactly, maybe through the traditions that have used these things that, and or that somehow spoke to you in the way that, that was going to be helpful to you. I don't know.
And one of the ideas that I think has some resonance with me is, so one of the people who I've had on the podcast many times, and I always approach all people who, claim to have any access to some psi phenomenon, whether it's channeling or whether it's, in this case, I'm speaking about Matthias de Stefano, who remembers his past lives. And I approach that with all right, bro, whatever. I'm not going to believe. But then when he starts saying things that resonate as true, things that I've found in my own journeys, things that I'm like, fuck, you just described exactly an experience that I had. You just put a framework on it that makes sense. And then also hearing him sing, bedtime songs that he sung when he was a mother in ancient Kem, which was in his recollection, a civilization that existed right after the flood that destroyed Atlantis. Mm-hmm. And he was singing in Atlantean to his child as a mother. And he sings that song to me. And it's like, how is this not real? In this kind of experience. So I've come to trust him. I've come to trust it, always still with like a little bit of, and he'll even say himself, this is just one way to understand the truth. But when he talks about some of the, because he was there when some of these monoliths were being built and stones that we're still trying to figure out how the fuck did they get this stone that was this many tons up this hill from this quarry across this river. It doesn't make sense. And he was, he'll have explanations of how they used song and kind of this ability for people to actually merge their consciousness with the stones and then raise the frequency of themselves, thus raising the stones, and then actually create levity in a material object, things that we can't do now. And I'll talk to him about it. I'll be like, well, why can't we do it now? And ultimately the understanding is that the field of belief, just like the placebo effect internally, our own field of belief impacts the matter that's within our body. The collective field of belief impacts our ability to affect matter collectively. So when you try to study something like this and you have all skeptics who are trying to prove that it's wrong, it doesn't surprise me that we can't prove it in that circumstance.
Right.
And then it requires actually a field of belief that makes it possible. Now, of course, that's an easy excuse,
right?
For everybody to say, oh, well, fuck it, like it's not real. It's not real unless you can prove it in the face of it. But if you actually adopt this other principle that the field of belief actually opens the possibility for something to happen, just like the field of your belief opens the placebo effect to change the matter in your body, it starts to allow some opening to make sense for what could be possible in these particular instances.
And then if you want to test it, it points you in a direction like, okay, placebo, well, we can do something to, not to, dismiss the placebo effect but we can at least say, oh, how much of it is pure pharmacology versus, your intentions and whatnot. And like, I think, what you're describing in sort of the area of psi research, it's been referred to as like the two effects, like I think the sheep and the goat effect. It's like one, it's like certain people that are sheep, they're going to believe whatever, but then there's goats. I hope I'm not missing this up. They're like, no matter what proof you might, put on the table, they say, bah, like, is that what a goat does? That's sheep. I don't forget my like animal impressions. Like, my 5-year-old's going to be disappointed in me. He's like, Dad, that's not a goat, but like
he's just going to force you to sing "Old MacDonald Had a Farm" like over and over again.
Let's go do this again, Dad.
Like, Dad, you got to get this right next time.
Certain people will dismiss it no matter what. The whole idea that and there is this idea that, like you were saying, like whether it's a field or whatever, that if the person doesn't believe it's going to happen, that it won't happen. Now, that's really interesting. And if you are a person who's like nerdy and into experimental design and analysis, it's actually a really interesting like challenge. Because if you look at some of that science on these psi phenomena, these people, whether you buy it or not, it's a fascinating, whether you buy that there's ultimately phenomena there that are real, it's a fascinating exercise in scientific understanding because it like an analysis. Because if you take this seriously, then you can set up the conditions like, okay, now let's assess, do it with people that are open to it, and in people who think it's all bullshit no matter what. And I don't know, you can start to, it's a more difficult if part of the explanation is like, well, the whole world has this vibe now that not enough people are, which it sounds like that's a little harder to deal with, but it does get you thinking about, well, what if it were true? How would we explore the area? Do we know that that's not true? And I'm not saying just because we can't prove it's not true doesn't mean it is true, but we also don't, we don't know that it's not true.
Yeah, no, it's I think the curiosity and the open-mindedness, that's the essence of science, that we're talking about over and over again here. And that's why it's so refreshing to talk to you about it, is because the ultimate curiosity, it's the humility of Don Howard, who is saying, I'm going to go learn from this medicine that I've been, working with for 50 years. And I'm a maestro of this, but I'm going in as a student. Mm-hmm. And I think all scientists, they can actually they can go the other way all too quickly. Like, I know everything. Okay, maybe. But I think that humility to be like, yeah, maybe that would be cool to test. Mm-hmm. Like maybe we don't have the resources and it would be hard to set it up, but yeah, it'd be cool to test. That to me makes me trust scientists and science when they have that open-mindedness. Like, yeah, let's see. Like, I wonder what, I wonder if,
Yeah.
that seems like real to me. That seems trustable.
Yeah. To me, it says people are true empiricists. Like they really are into evaluating the world based on evidence, including the evidence of their own experience, and it's, I don't know, science isn't about believing. Science isn't the same as, materialism or philosophy of, any sort of these like, philosophies of what's the ultimate nature of everything. Science is a way of going about like answering or asking, that's the main point, asking questions and trying to figure some things out, and to just kind of dismiss, entire topics because they're kind of outside of that Overton window, just like, which is in politics, like certain things are just like beyond the pale. It's like that, that's not going to work. So we just can't go there, even though if most of the people in a certain party or whatever or group believe in it, they're like, it's just not realistic. But there's all kinds of stuff that are like that. And what humbles me is that psychedelics were in that spot for decades.
Yeah.
And so then I think, what else is out there that everyone dismisses and laughs at and ridicules, as unscientific, as like wishful thinking that might, 20 years from now, 200 years from now, or is just viewed as like this world changing, this paradigm shift discovery. Like,
yeah. And just to look at the history, nutrition, I think, thank you for reading my book, and you've referenced it a few times on the day. I talk about how there was a big shift where everybody was saying, you got to remove all the fat from everything and let's just replace it with sugar.
Oh, yeah.
Disaster.
Great idea.
Disaster. And then fast forward and all of a sudden butter's on the cover of Time magazine and being like, is this actually healthier than vegetable oil? And obviously all of the research now is coming out and saying, yes, even though you'll still have strange outlier, usually government nutritionists will be like, no, Lucky Charms are better for you than eggs.
Right.
And you're like, what? I reposted something that showed that. It was like frosted mini wheats were like way healthier than an egg. And I was like, what are you talking about here? But ultimately the science shifted dramatically.
Oh, yeah.
Dramatically. And it's not that it's not actually that the reality shifted. It's just that our understanding of the reality shifted.
Now sugar is bad for you. It was good for you back then. Now,
right.
It's like, it's absolutely. And then it's again humbling thinking about like what causes that. As we know, there were like real financial incentives. There was industry interactions. There was like the funding of science. And I tell you what, because I've been funded by NIH for like about 20 years. And doing various, not just, not psychedelics, but recently with psychedelics, but just studying all kinds of stuff about drugs. Like there are certain things that are just in fashion and that fall out of fashion, and people pay attention. They know if this is something that the director of an NIH institute is not into. And there are certain things that are like career killers, like that drive, like it's so hard for the public to understand like how that could like completely drive a narrative, how that could end up with decades of like an American diet that has killed countless people, and with the idea that it was originally based on science and people. The contingencies are so complex and real. I mean, people are concerned about their careers. I mean, there was stuff like memory training research, and I got a grant. I got a 5-year grant, like millions of dollars to like study, like if you can get opioid and cocaine users to just do these memory games. Are we gonna, the reason that people, and I never bought into this enough, but like whatever, I thought there might be something interesting there. And there's also value in showing that something doesn't work. But this idea that the reason people can't stop doing cocaine is because the cocaine has made them so stupid that they can't, listen to the therapy and understand it. Like that's literally like millions and millions and millions of dollars were spent to explore this. And it was all garbage. I mean, it didn't. And again, there's nothing wrong with like at least testing something to show that it doesn't work. But like that was so and then it fell out of favor. Like there's these trends that just don't make, like to me that never really made, sense. I mean, gosh, I've known plenty of people with problems, and it's like, even if there's some correlation with but I mean, some of the smartest people in the world are addicted to, you name it.
Sure.
And it's not that, like, whatever. Like, is it knocked off 1 or 2 IQ points? Like, whatever. That's the main thing is their whole life has been drawn into this pattern with this, like, more exclusive focus on this thing that's been detrimental to them. And anyway, there are these narratives that just take off and you're afraid. Like, certain things you just know it won't get funded. And then at another level, if you study certain things, ooh, this is going to be my reputation. I'm never going to get funded.
Right.
I mean,
Right, you're
like,
gonna be
it's
a pariah.
hard to. I mean, I've had more colleagues than I can count that have been, sweat it, and they've had to leave a place like Johns Hopkins. It could, like, they're brutal. You lose your you could be bringing in funding for years and years and years, and they take huge chunks of it, of course, and then you go without some grant funding for a few months, and all of a sudden they make you reduce your salary and all this stuff. Like, yeah, it's really, you don't want to run out of funding as a scientist, and like, you'll study any asinine thing that you wouldn't even put bets on, just to keep yourself in the game.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I studied the memory stuff because now I'm able to study psychedelics. It kept me alive as a scientist, but
people don't understand the mechanisms to the full extent.
Right. And
of,
we
like,
gotta,
how much they're there.
Which it really annoys me when people, as much as don't misunderstand me, it's like the environmental crisis is real, but when people, try to convince others, like 99% of scientists, it's like, oh God, 99% of scientists thought the Earth was the center of the universe at one point. Like, this is not how you make a scientific argument.
Sure. And also, like, you have to recognize that if you come out against something, then there again, the cascade. Are you going to be cast out by your peers? Are you going to be denied grants? Are you going to be, there's just so many forces of a big system like this. It almost feels like the only egalitarian way to do this would be to crowdfund everything, just have like upvoting, like you would see in like a fucking Reddit post, like, let's upvote these studies. Yeah, of course, then there'd be people campaigning and gaming that, but at least in some way, like, it feels like democratizing funding in an interesting way where people were like able to support, seems like a healthier way to do this than the more centralized focus where you got a big pool of cash and then you're just fighting to try and get the right approvals for that cash rather than just, but it's happening. I've helped fund some different studies myself, and I think the private sector it's an important role that the private sector can play in actually funding things that wouldn't get grants.
Absolutely. I mean, just the leverage that you have, especially at times when there is that window where there's something really going on here, but yet the world hasn't quite figured it out. Like, the government's not funding it yet. I mean, this is the way Tim Ferriss put it with, funding a lot of the psychedelic, research, that, like, imagine if you really are concerned about having an impact, one could step in with a, an amount of money that, thrown into, you could throw it into all kinds of great things, into cancer research, but, and it would hopefully have some incremental, it would add to this, but it's not going to move the needle. Not that those areas don't deserve to be focused on. It's not going, given the nature of understandable attention those areas have, but like, you put that same relatively small amount of money into something like this, like at this point in time, and it's like, whoa, you could draw a direct line in a few years. It's like, okay, these compounds have now been approved and they're helping, like, whatever, how many people with these disorders we now understand. I think the scientific discoveries are just going to keep mounting, just aside from therapeutics, just an understanding like this, the nature of the mind.
I did a podcast with John Dean, who's done some research on endogenous DMT.
Yes, I saw part of that, I think.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And he has, ultimately his hypothesis is that DMT, endogenous DMT, is actually what helps us build our understanding of reality. He's likening it to a neurotransmitter because he's been able to isolate and find, quantities in the cerebral spinal fluid in different amounts, way higher amounts. And of course, it degrades very quickly when you try to actually measure it. So they've had to use very specific, methods to actually measure this. And then he's having some theories about how DMT actually helps us create our understanding of reality. Because of course, as we know, everything that we think of as solid is actually just particles moving around
Yeah.
at certain densities and certain vibrations, and it's all emanations of light or vibration or all of these things. But what's making us see reality is like, well, maybe DMT is a quote neurotransmitter that's actually helping us build this reality. And those studies have been, not that expensive, but interesting, and then open up possibilities like, okay, what's the next one? What's the next one we can do to build on that? Because it opens up a whole new blue ocean, if you were going to use a business terminology,
Yeah.
like a blue ocean of science of
Right.
what that could ultimately lead to, that could ultimately have some impossible benefit down the road.
Right. This very, very kind of basic level of like the human organism as an interface with reality. We've just thought, implicitly we just assume we're in this like, Newtonian universe where it's like, here's the backdrop and all these things are we're part in, within that thing. And it's like, we know that's not the case in terms, broadly speaking, in terms of science. It's just like, there's this one big system that we're part of, and it's like so incredibly complex, but, we don't, we know that, as you see, it's not color, it's like, wavelengths of EM wave, like
Right.
what is really reality? Like there's no sound,
Right.
there's no, and apparently then like time and space itself may be in that same category
Sure.
of like, that's just our psychological interpretation of this thing, whatever it is out there. And so I don't know, psychedelics do like, hopefully they can be tools to, to understand how, not just like the therapeutics of psychedelics, but like, how do we create this psychedelic experience? Our everyday reality is a psychedelic experience. Like, and there is a modulation of reality. Like, why do we think this is real? And then we do something like we sleep, or we take some, crazy compound, or we breathe really heavy, and all of a sudden the idea that this is real, like we start to reevaluate that, like, and see that as kind of like this kind of trivial thing.
Mm-hmm.
What's really real is something else. It's like, what's going on there, and to what degree that type of thinking has been going on, has an evolution maybe involving DMT. Is that involved with like when when the tribe gets together and has these rituals that create that social cohesion that convinces people to jump to the front when the enemy village attacks, or to go on the hunting mission you may not come back from because the tribe depends on it. Like, to what degree has that sort of like reality making like been a very real, it's been real fodder for natural selection.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's all incredibly interesting. And also the correlation, we talked about holotropic breathing, also showing the correlation between that Wim Hof deeper breathing techniques, the hyperoxygenation, and the upregulating of endogenous DMT, like how much is actually produced in that. So that could explain some of these things. It starts to melt different boundaries of reality and different wall. It's so interesting to actually start to explore that. And I think so as we're wrapping up this podcast, I'd like to ask two questions. One is, what study has happened that comes to mind, or if there's two, that's fine, that recently you've been aware of that you found particularly interesting, either from a therapeutic standpoint or otherwise, that you could share the results of? And then if you had a magic 8-ball of unlimited funding, what thing would you like to study? If you could just be like, all right, I got unlimited funds, so something that's happened and something in your fantasy world of something you'd like to study.
Yeah. So gosh, there's so many things I could name. One thing that comes to mind, and there have been some very early results, but it hasn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The study's ongoing, but my colleague Peter Hendricks at University of Alabama, Birmingham, is studying psilocybin in the treatment of cocaine addiction. And sounds like there's something going on, like it's working with people. And if that ends up working, that's just going to be a game changer for addiction. It's like I'm talking hundreds of compounds, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent trying to find some medication that at least take the edge off of cocaine addiction to help people. It's pretty much been a big fat nothing. And so if there's really something there, so I really want to encourage folks to keep their eye on that work. Hopefully it's going to wrap up in I'm not sure, within the next year, I would imagine. So that's something I'd really encourage people to keep their eye on.
Because cocaine addiction is pretty, of all the addictions, it's pretty detrimental.
Oh, it's.
I mean, it's one of, I've experienced a lot of different drugs, and I don't have a judgmental attitude. I just think of these as ways to modulate the system, and I don't have the puritanical or government enforced ideas about it. So if cocaine was something that I liked, I would do it every once in a while for sure. I fucking hate it. It's the worst. It's like I feel really cool for 10 minutes. I talk too much, and then I will reevaluate my life for the next 2 days afterwards. It's like the worst. And I know this is just, again, my experience. So I don't touch it. Like I'm not even fucking interested in that particular drug. But I've seen how that one in particular, and I'm not around a lot of heroin users. It's just not part of the, and I also never, even experienced that or dared to endeavor to experience that. Although probably in the right setting, I would probably smoke a little opium just to kind of get a vibe of it. I would probably explore that if I had the chance. Never have, but carefully, because I think all of these things are slippery slopes. But nonetheless, the point being that those people who I've seen with cocaine habits and behavior on cocaine, and also the deterioration of life on that, it's a steep decline, and it's a heavy cost.
Yeah, not everyone.
Not everyone.
Like most substances, like all substances, most people that try it don't become addicted. But if you're in that 20-some% that does go on, like how bad does it look if you go to the end? When it gets, how bad can bad get? It looks really, really bad with cocaine, and it looks really, really bad with methamphetamine. Even
for sure.
And drugs are so different. I don't want to get into they all have their ups and downs, but sure, the risk of acute lethal overdose is higher on opioids, particularly these days with all the fentanyl derivatives floating around and the opioid supplies. But barring, if you're one of, if you're not one of those folks that whatever just goes out on a single injection of an opioid, you're going to be healthier than the cocaine and methamphetamine users. It's just those are really hard drugs on the body. And again, I'm not saying any of this is good. I'm not encouraging any of it.
And also,
cocaine is particularly
deadly
hard.
when you do too much and you want to come down, and then you take a bunch of benzos, and then you start to create that crossover of moving your body up really high and then trying to move your body down, and that's when a lot of people die.
Yeah, it's usually combinations of things. It's benzos are, a lot of people don't talk enough about that. A lot of the opioid lethal overdoses, combinations with either alcohol or benzos, and sometimes with stimulants like cocaine. But even the nature of people trying to, there's something so reinforcing about cocaine. In animals, like rats, there's nothing like it. If you want to get an animal, just press that bar. Even to the degree that we'll stop eating. Cocaine is your, nothing will come as close.
I mean, you see it at a
cocaine.
Party. Someone has a bump of Coke and the Coke runs out. They are running around like a zombie looking for brains.
Yeah.
It's who's got the next fucking bump? And you're like, and if, for me, I used to be at more parties where that was more prevalent, and I still, again, that was not my vibe. And I would prefer a little bit of psilocybin and have some beers. And I would watch people on cocaine and be like, look at the zombies. What is going on? It was I had this interesting purview of this kind of glossy. Yeah. And again, that's not everybody. I don't want to generalize. And I'm sure some people have healthy relationships. Right. Certainly when I've gone to the Sacred Valley in Peru, I drink plenty of coca tea, and I've had some mambe, which is the coca leaf ground up. Totally different experience. Right. And actually isn't even that particularly stimulating in general, because I think there's so many different alkaloids, in coca.
Helps you with the elevation sickness and all of that. Yeah.
But I guess this is the longest way of saying it's a big deal. The study that you're talking about, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
I think it would be a huge game. I mean, kind of like the ultimate. If something's effective, and the hope, what I was always interested in with psychedelics and addiction is that the stories that people tell are not about, it's not like a crutch to overcome this or that addiction. It's people get to the bottom of what it is to be addicted. That the thing that cuts across, whether you're talking about tobacco or
Right.
cocaine or opioids or alcohol, you name it, and that's the heart of addiction. If addiction was about just overcoming physical withdrawal, we would have solved addiction, almost 100 years ago when we were doing crazy shit like putting people in comas on purpose for a month. Like, you'll get past the withdrawal, or which I put in the same category, pretty much going to a Club Med type resort where it's easy not to do coke when you're on a beach and you're being fed like lovely food and there's lovely people around you treating you like awesome. It's like, yeah, now you go back home. What's the first thing you do?
Right.
So it's, you name the drug, whether it's, again, opioids or cigarettes, how many people have relapsed far after the physical withdrawal is gone? They've relapsed a month later, 6 months later, 20 years later, And so it's not like the physical dependence is just, so many of our treatments are just addressing that part. And that's not, whether it's nicotine patch or whatever, or methadone. And not to knock these tools. I think they all have their place, and a lot of people have been helped, but to the degree that they're very limited, where people aren't helped, it's like that, those deeper questions that a good psychedelic experience seems to help people with, that, like, what's the story of your life? What's really, really happening here, big picture? And how is this, like, whatever you're talking about, cocaine, tobacco, how is it really fitting into that? And when that's like square in the face, like, a lot of people like whatever, they have this clarity that sticks with them. And my God, what is that? So that to me is like, we're making real progress. If that works for cocaine, which again is kind of, you could argue, the ultimate test, because there's nothing that really comes close, like, that would just be a real game changer for not just treating, but understanding addiction.
Yeah. I think that, there's two models that really I appreciate, and I haven't been particularly prone to classic addictions, though tobacco is a pretty regular. I do hape and I do tobacco pouches, and but I feel like I've never felt like I needed to. It's just like it's part of my it's part of my like practice, and I feel like a good relationship with it. But again, but everything else, I almost have like an anti-addictive quality where it's like, if I do it for a while, like, I don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
Like, I drink a night, and like, I don't want to drink the next night or the next 4 nights. So I think it's just my natural psychology. But so I don't have the most personal experience with it. But there's two models. Of course, Gabor Mate, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
Addiction is an attempt to solve a problem, and he usually links it to some kind of trauma, trying to solve a traumatic problem. But another kind of model that one of my teachers, Rabbi Mark Gaffney, has been, talking to me about, is like, it's an attempt to solve the feeling of emptiness that we feel from not being engaged, in his language, erotically with life, with not being participatory in Shekinah, in this kind of field of eros, which is in the food we have, in the conversations we're in our contact with life. So we'll choose things that bring what he calls pseudo-eros, which is like a feeling of connection to life again. So alcohol allows us to connect with the moment or the music or our friends, or, nicotine allows us to connect with our work, or, cocaine allows us to connect with us feeling confident about ourselves. Whatever the thing is, it's about, there's this sense of emptiness, and then there's this mechanism that's like allows you to feel the contact that we crave as a response to the emptiness we feel. So even if it's not trauma-based, it's like, can we deal with the emptiness, and do we have the skills and strategies to make contact without exogenous substances,
right,
so that we fill the emptiness with the fullness which is available in life? So I think somewhere between those is my own kind of understanding. And I know it's a complex and nuanced field, and there is physical dependency, all that, but both of those models really make a lot of sense to me.
And progress with psychedelics, I think, can be, like with a lot of things, it's like not just them as tools, but if they can be tools to help us not just directly treat, but to understand the nature of these things, like you described with addiction, that's going to end up helping a lot of people. And that's what I think is even bigger, like what psychedelics can really teach us about the, human, condition, which is why I think a lot of the things, like to your other question of like, what I, do. And like, I think it's so many of the questions there, like what would the ultimate, I don't know, like some of the stuff we've talked about here, some of these kind of extraordinary claims of, psi phenomenon, telepathy, like that would be a really interesting area to really jump into, deeply with psychedelics, because there's very interesting anecdotes of these types of experiences being enhanced or more likely with psychedelics.
Yep.
Again, don't know whether it's true or not, but if it's testable, I think it's interesting, and like what's going on there. Even if it's not, if it doesn't, and even if there's no there, it's still really interesting, because like there's the phenomenon of people thinking that there's something there, and are psychedelics more likely to make people buy into something that maybe is not there? So even at that level, it's interesting.
Yeah.
But what if there's something there too?
Right.
What if psychedelics really are somehow opening, like dissolving boundaries at some layer we're not even aware of yet? And then some maybe a little closer to Earth out there, and there, just the effects on neurological conditions. So all of what we know psychedelics, a lot of them induce neuroplasticity in rats. Probably true in humans, although we don't know. So as you know, a lot of athletes claim that psychedelics have been helpful in recovering for injury. So injuries like neurological. Sure. So like, sports with head impact, like combat sports, all the combat.
I mean, it's been shown that psilocybin does promote neurogenesis, right? Like the repair of the brain.
So different types of there's more evidence for. And ultimately doesn't really matter. So different types of neuroplasticity, which is a more general term. So that could mean branching of growing new branches off of the same neuron. It could mean synaptogenesis, which is those branches forming connections with other existing neurons. And it could be, and there's some evidence, but not as much as with the other areas, that neurogenesis, that's the birth of new cells, new neurons. So it appears that it seems no question that neuroplasticity, multiple forms of neuroplasticity are unfolding. Now that said, just more neuroplasticity isn't always a good thing. I mean, I don't know, like growing new cells isn't always a good thing.
Sure.
A type of that we call cancer, but it is like very intriguing that maybe that might be underlying some of this radical learning that people are having, and maybe that people claim these insights that change their lives, and maybe part of that, can account for, like, I mean, there's athletes that claim just their memory is just a lot better. Since they've been, using psychedelics.
No doubt.
Or
if you're like, my buddy Aaron Rodgers, maybe you win 2 NFL MVPs after your first ayahuasca experience, like obviously you can't, that's the thing. There's no way to test. There's no alternate multiverse where you test Aaron with the ayahuasca experience and Aaron without. Does he win 2 MVPs with and without? Of course you can't split test that. It's one person's life.
Right.
But it's, it's certainly interesting. And you could develop studies where you did measure career performance, or you did measure athletic performance, and something like that, like after intensive psychedelic treatments. I mean, I was a part of a ceremony where, and I won't mention who it is, but a, kind of mid-ranked UFC fighter who had no title shot, planned or anything like that. He was a couple fights away from a title shot, at least 2 fights away from a title shot, goes into a DMT ceremony. In the DMT ceremony, he sees himself holding the belt, the championship belt. He's like, I fucking saw it, bro. Like I saw it. I could feel it. I felt how heavy it was. I felt it. I saw it. And then, so the person who was fighting the champion in his division got injured, had to pull out of a fight. He gets last minute called up. He's like a 9-1 underdog. I shouldn't probably say exactly how people would try to figure this out. He's a strong underdog in this, has the fight of his life, as the underdog, and wins the championship, and he fought unbelievable. And so there's so many interesting things that are happening that are not medical related, but performance related. And it, like, he credits a lot of that. Of course, he's a great fighter. He trained hard and he busted his ass, and all those things are all true. Yeah. But he had such unwavering belief because he'd already felt himself with the belt. Right. So in those moments where it got tough and he's like, I've already seen this reality. Like I've seen the ending of this movie. Now I've just got to play out the middle part, the how and the when. And so like, it's really interesting to start. I would love to see some of those to start to dispel some of these myths about like what it's going to do. Like it could make you better at whatever it is that you're doing. You know,
that's
start time, like, and start times off the blocks. Interesting studies like this for athletes. I don't know. This is just a curiosity that's coming to my mind. Like, what about your start times off the block if you're like a sprinter?
Yeah, something
you know
very
what I mean?
measurable.
Something very measurable. Like,
yeah.
all right, now you're on psilocybin, now you're on LSD, and like now, like what's your fucking reaction time in this? I don't know. Is that useful for the world? Kind of, because it kind of just starts to dispel these myths that we have about this is something that makes you crazy and isn't helpful for performance, and you got to stay focused. But like, what if your career is better? And we hear many of these stories about psychedelic experiences opening up different fields of technology, and Steve Jobs talking about all of this other
the internet,
all of this other stuff,
open source software. Yeah,
it would be really curious to me to start studying these things that people would be like, that's an interesting study, like sprinters off the block, like what's happening there.
I think that's fascinating because we know that setting goals is powerful, and there's some science, but in everyday life, we all know, like it's just this insane, so was he seeing into the future? Maybe, or, at another level, maybe he's just had such that the thing I'm sure all, world-class athletes try to do, is like, you got to believe it, you got to envision, but like, belief. He's like, no, I was there. Like all the regular, this is not regular pep talk. This was like,
I was there.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you can hold, with that in your mind, I say this with like addiction, these experiences can be so deep. It's like in that one weakest moment when you've had a couple drinks and you think, maybe I'll have that cigarette again, in your very weakest, those split second decisions, like those microseconds in like, in the octagon where someone's like, I can't do it. I'm going to like, this guy's taking my head off. I'm done. It's like where it's just like, you're going to go further into the impossible. It's like, in front of countless people and like, I know. With your entire reputation and just that more solid vision is able to just allow you to persevere. That's amazing. If we figure something out there, it's like, it may not be DMT, it may be something else, but like what's happening in the brain, or what's happening to the
right.
If we can harness that, okay, now it's like maybe the goal is like going into negotiating a peace deal,
totally.
or solving,
totally.
a solution to a famine.
There's a track that guides you, and of course this is old, wisdom of Yeshua, pray as if it has already been done. The idea is that you're not asking for something, you go to the reality where it's already happened. It's all of Dr. Joe Dispenza's work. It's all this idea of how to actually harness the placebo effect, which is believing that you're already healed, or believing that this thing is done, and using these psychedelics to like on a track with some guidance, again, having, instead of just a performance coach, which there's plenty of, life coaches of all sorts, in this field saying like, okay, yeah, all right, maybe you're here to, work on this addiction, but also what's that big, hairy dream of yours, that goal that you want, like, and let's see yourself there, and then let's see yourself taking every step that you need to. And in these altered states, maybe with the increase in neuroplasticity, maybe with the modulation of somehow the ability to see it more clearly, and the confidence to believe it, maybe it's a serotonergic confidence or a dopaminergic concept, who knows? But whatever it is, you just get this solid belief, and it just starts changing people's lives.
Yeah.
Or working through different patterns they have. Like, I get really angry when my partner does this, and like go in and like, all right, so this is going to happen again, but now we're going to write a different story.
Yeah.
And you're going to respond this way differently, almost like hypnosis, but without hypnosis. It's like you're just working on the field of belief. Yeah. That's really interesting to me too.
We need to bottle that.
For sure.
Any progress we make in these areas, because it's widely applicable.
Yeah.
Including to all the things that we need to do to make this world a better place.
Yeah. All right. Well, one final caveat, please don't take this discussion and do any drugs or medicine without really being deeply called to it, minding all of the boundaries of safety and also minimum effective dose. Be very mindful, and be mindful of legality, be mindful of everything. We are not recommending that you do any of these things that we talked about. Just because I did it doesn't mean that you should do it. Everybody's different. So please, please, please be mindful. This is not a recommendation to do any of these things. That is your choice. and you have to make that choice. So I want to make that very clear. And then I also want to make it very clear to you that I'm an ally. If you ever need anything, if there's a funding for a crazy thing, if there's a way that I can support the work that you're doing or a work of a colleague, like
Thank
you can count on me to spread the word and show up and support, because I deeply believe that as psychedelic medicine has helped me, it can also help so many people in the world when done the right way.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been amazing. And thanks everybody for tuning in. So much love. Bye. Thanks for tuning into this podcast with Matthew Johnson. If you are interested in joining us in Sedona for our next and final Fit for Service Summit of the year, head to fitforservice.com and you can check out the Sedona Summit. It's going to be pretty epic. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week.